I am Calvin Brooks, 68 years old, and I spent my entire life building an empire from the ground up so my family would never know the sting of poverty. At Thanksgiving dinner, my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and told me to stay away from Christmas because I was nothing but a burden with the stench of poverty. My own son stood there sipping wine and agreed with her. I did not yell or argue. I simply walked out into the snow. That same night, I made a single phone call to execute the foreclosure on her father's entire real estate company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an arrogant person a lesson they will never forget. The dining room of the Gallagher estate was a masterpiece of modern wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over 20 of Chicago's most elite socialites. I stood in the doorway wearing my best corduroy jacket, holding a homemade sweet potato pie. It was a family recipe, a peace offering for a family that had never accepted me. My daughter-in-law Megan wore a silk designer dress that cost more than the car I drove. She spotted me, and her fake smile instantly vanished. She marched across the hardwood floor, her heels clicking like a ticking clock. She snatched the pie from my hands without a single word of greeting. She walked directly to the stainless steel trash can and dumped the entire pie inside. The ceramic dish shattered against the bottom. The loud crash silenced the entire room. 20 wealthy guests turned to stare at me. No one said a word. The silence was thick and suffocating. Megan turned back to me with a look of pure disgust on her face. Her eyes scanned my worn-out shoes and my inexpensive jacket. She told me I was embarrassing her in front of her important guests. She said my presence was ruining the aesthetic of her perfect Thanksgiving dinner. She told me I smelled like a cheap nursing home and that my very existence was a stain on her family reputation. Every word was meant to strip away my dignity. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to apologize for being alive. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my breathing steady. I looked past her and searched the room for my son, Terrence. I needed to see his reaction. I had worked 2 jobs for 20 years to put him through the best schools so he could stand in rooms like this. Terrence was leaning against the marble kitchen island. He was holding a glass of expensive red wine. He saw the pie go into the trash. He heard every hateful word his wife just spat at me. I waited for him to step forward. I waited for the boy I raised to defend his father. Instead, Terrence took a slow sip of his wine. He adjusted his silk tie and looked down at the floor. He refused to meet my eyes. He let out a heavy sigh as if my humiliation was an inconvenience to his evening. Megan noticed his silence and it gave her more power. She stepped closer to me and lowered her voice to a harsh whisper so only the people nearest to us could hear. She told me I was a social burden and a financial parasite. She demanded that I stay away from their Christmas party next month. She said she could not tolerate looking at my pathetic face during the holidays. She told me to go back to my tiny apartment and rot in isolation. Terrence finally spoke, but not to defend me. He told me I should probably leave to keep the peace. He said I was upsetting Megan and ruining the holiday spirit. He told me to drive home safely and that he would call me next week when things cooled down. The betrayal hit me harder than any physical blow ever could. The son I had sacrificed everything for had just chosen the comfort of his rich wife over the dignity of his father. He sold his soul for a seat at their table. The guests began to whisper among themselves. A few of them looked at me with pity. I did not want their pity. Pity is a weapon used by the comfortable to feel superior. I looked at Megan. Her chin was raised in victory. She thought she had won. She thought she had put the poor black man back in his place. She thought I was completely dependent on her father's wealth to support my son. She had absolutely no idea who I really was. She had no idea about the corporate structures and the trust funds I had built over 40 years. She only saw the faded jacket and the old shoes. I did not raise my voice. I did not show them a single drop of anger. Anger is loud and reckless. True power is completely silent. I looked Terrence in the eyes one last time. I wanted to memorize the exact moment he threw me away. Then I turned around and walked toward the front door. I put my coat back on. The heavy wooden door closed behind me with a solid thud. The freezing Chicago wind hit my face the moment I stepped onto the porch. Snow was falling heavily, covering the long driveway and the expensive luxury cars parked all around. I walked past the Mercedes and the Range Rovers until I reached my old Ford sedan parked at the very end of the street. I bought this car 12 years ago specifically to blend in. I unlocked the door and sat in the cold driver's seat. The engine sputtered to life. I gripped the steering wheel and watched the bright lights of the Gallagher mansion through my snowy windshield. Inside that house, they were laughing and drinking, celebrating my departure. They thought they had successfully discarded a useless old man. My heart was completely calm. The pain of my son's betrayal had instantly transformed into a cold and calculating focus. I had spent the last 3 years playing the role of the humble father-in-law because I wanted Terrence to be happy. I had ignored Megan's disrespect. I had ignored Richard Gallagher's condescending jokes about my neighborhood. I had hidden my massive wealth because I wanted my son to build his own character. But his character was rotten. He was weak and greedy. The time for humility was over. The time for education had begun. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. The snow continued to fall, wiping away my tire tracks as if I had never been there. I drove through the wealthy neighborhood feeling a deep sense of clarity. Every dollar I had given them would now become a chain around their necks. Every ounce of power they thought they had over me was an illusion. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed a private number I had not used in months. The phone rang twice before a sharp voice answered. It was Bradley Foster, my lead corporate attorney and wealth manager. I did not bother with greetings. I told Bradley to cancel his holiday plans. I instructed him to open the sealed files on the Gallagher real estate portfolio immediately. I told him to activate the default clauses on every single loan we secretly held over their heads. I ordered him to initiate the foreclosure process on the Gallagher corporate headquarters first thing Monday morning. I told him to freeze every line of credit tied to my hidden trust. As I hung up the phone, I drove onto the highway heading back to my empty apartment. The game had officially changed. Megan wanted me out of her house. I was about to take everything she owned. The morning after Thanksgiving, my phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock. The caller ID flashed my son's name. I answered the call, and before I could even say a word, Terrence was screaming so loudly the speaker on my phone crackled. He was standing inside a luxury Porsche dealership in downtown Chicago. He had just tried to put a down payment on a brand new Cayenne for Megan as an apology gift for the ruined dinner. The salesman had swiped his platinum credit card 3 times. 3 times the machine beeped red. The card was declined in front of a showroom full of wealthy customers and the dealership manager. Terrence was losing his mind. He yelled into the phone, demanding to know what I had done. He told me the bank must have made a massive error and that I needed to call them immediately to fix it. His voice was shaking with embarrassment. The salesman had asked him to step aside so paying customers could complete their transactions. Terrence felt the sting of public humiliation, the very same humiliation Megan had inflicted on me just 12 hours earlier. He paced back and forth in the dealership lobby, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He cursed the bank. He cursed the credit card company. He demanded that I wire him $50,000 directly from the account to cover the down payment so he could save face. He was completely frantic. He thought the money supply was an infinite river that would never run dry. He thought his only problem was a technical glitch. He had absolutely no idea the river had already been dammed. I listened to his panicked breathing over the line, completely silent. I let him scream until his lungs were empty. When Terrence finally stopped yelling about the declined card, his panic quickly turned into vicious anger. He shifted the blame entirely onto my shoulders. He told me this was all my fault. He claimed that because I had offended Megan and her family last night, Richard Gallagher must have made a call to the bank to teach me a lesson. Terrence truly believed that the Gallagher family controlled the universe and that my disrespectful behavior had brought this punishment down upon him. He hissed into the phone, his words dripping with venom. He told me I was a foolish old man who did not know his place in the world. He said I had single-handedly destroyed his reputation and jeopardized his marriage. He demanded that I fix this disaster immediately. His voice dropped into a cold, commanding tone. He ordered me to drive straight to the Gallagher estate right that very minute. He told me I needed to get down on my knees and beg Megan for forgiveness. He wanted me to grovel in front of her father and apologize for being an embarrassment. He said I had to promise them I would never show my face at another family event. He told me it was the only way Richard would unlock the accounts and restore his credit limit. Terrence said if I did not do exactly as he commanded, he would disown me. He threatened to cut me out of his life completely. He said I would die alone in my cheap apartment and no one would even bother to claim my body. Every single word he spoke was a desperate attempt to protect his lavish lifestyle. He was willing to sacrifice his own father's pride just to get back behind the wheel of a luxury car. He spoke to me as if I were a disobedient dog that needed to be punished. He demanded my total submission. He demanded my complete surrender to the Gallagher family. I let his threats wash over me like water off a stone. His anger was meaningless. His threats were empty. He was a puppet dancing on strings he could not even see. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The silence stretched between us for a long time. I waited until Terrence finished his pathetic rant. When the line went completely quiet, I finally spoke. My voice was calm, flat, and completely devoid of any emotion. I told Terrence that Richard Gallagher had absolutely nothing to do with the credit card. I told him Richard did not call the bank. Richard did not freeze the account. I told him I did it. I locked the card. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Terrence was stunned into silence. He could not comprehend what I was saying. I continued speaking with the precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. I informed him that the Platinum card was not issued through his father-in-law. It was issued through a subsidiary of the Brooks Family Trust, my trust. I told him that for the past 3 years I had been personally funding his lifestyle. I reminded him of the $15,000 monthly allowance that magically appeared in his checking account on the first of every month. I told him that allowance was now permanently terminated. The money was gone. The credit lines were closed. The safety net he had relied on his entire adult life had just been cut. Terrence stammered, his brain struggling to process the information. He asked me what I meant by my trust. He asked how a retired old man living in a rented apartment could possibly control a Platinum corporate account. I did not bother to explain my financial empire to him. I did not tell him about the venture capital firm I had built in secret. I only told him the harsh reality of his new life. I told him he was now entirely on his own. He would have to pay for his own luxury cars. He would have to pay for his own designer clothes. He would have to figure out how to survive in the world without my money padding his bank account. I told him the era of my silent financial support was officially over. I told him that if Megan loved him as much as he thought she could buy the Porsche herself. I told him my days of being his invisible ATM were finished. Terrence let out a sudden sharp laugh. It was a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the phone. He refused to believe a single word I said. He sneered and told me I was completely losing my mind. He said my old age had finally made me delusional. He firmly believed I was a poor, pathetic man making up ridiculous lies to protect my wounded ego. He told me I was pathetic for pretending to have money when everyone knew I lived in a rundown neighborhood. His tone shifted from anger to pure malice. He decided to hit me where he knew it would hurt the most. He told me that since I wanted to play games and refused to apologize, I would never see my grandson Leo ever again. He banned me from their lives. He swore that if I ever came near his house or tried to contact his child, he would call the police and have me arrested for trespassing. He was extremely confident that he held all the power. He hung up the phone with a violent click, convinced he had put a crazy old man back in his place. He had no idea the trap had already snapped shut. The loud crash of my apartment door being kicked open echoed through the narrow hallway. It was 3:00 in the afternoon on a freezing Tuesday. I was sitting at my small kitchen table drinking a cup of black tea. 3 massive men stepped over the splintered wood of my door frame and entered my living room. They did not look like regular debt collectors. They wore expensive leather jackets and carried themselves with the arrogant swagger of men who were used to hurting people for money. They wiped their snowy boots on my worn-out rug, intentionally staining the fabric. They were fixated on my old furniture and the simple layout of my home. I did not stand up. I did not flinch. I slowly set my teacup down on the saucer. The largest of the 3 men stepped forward. He had a thick neck and a jagged scar running down his jawline. He looked around my modest apartment with absolute disgust, as if he had stepped into a sewer. He loudly announced that he worked directly for Richard Gallagher. He proudly stated that Richard had recently purchased the property management company that controlled this entire apartment complex. The scarred thug smiled a cruel and ugly smile exposing yellow teeth. He told me my lease was being terminated immediately. He said I had exactly 1 hour to pack my pathetic belongings and get out on the street into the freezing snow. He promised that if I was still inside the building when the hour was up, he and his friends would physically throw me out the 3rd-story window. They thought they were dealing with a frightened and helpless old man. They thought a little bit of violence would easily break my spirit. They wanted to see me beg for mercy. They wanted me to cry and ask for more time. I simply looked at the broken door and calculated the cost of the repair. The scarred man realized I was not reacting the way he expected. My total silence deeply irritated him. He stepped closer to the kitchen table and slammed a thick manila folder down right next to my teacup. He forcefully pulled out a legal document and a heavy black pen. He shoved the paper toward me across the wooden table. It was a formal relinquishment of visitation rights. The document explicitly stated that I was willingly giving up all legal rights to see my grandson Leo ever again. It also included a strict restraining order drafted by Megan. The thug leaned over the table, casting a large, dark shadow over me. He told me Terrence and Megan wanted this nightmare to be over. He said all I had to do was sign the paper, and they would give me $1,000 in cash to find a new place to live. He called it a generous relocation fee from a caring family. He told me it was the best deal a worthless old man could ever hope to get. I looked down at the legal document. The wording was highly aggressive and filled with blatant lies about my mental instability. Megan had actually accused me of being a violent danger to my own grandson. The audacity of her lies was impressive. The other two men moved closer to the table, cracking their knuckles and blocking my path to the hallway. The scarred man tapped the black pen repeatedly against the table to intimidate me. He told me I had two choices. I could sign the paper and walk away with a little bit of cash, or I could refuse and they would beat me until my hands were too broken to hold the pen. He proudly declared that no one in this cheap neighborhood would ever bother to call the police to save an old black man. He was incredibly confident in his physical power and his employer's influence. He truly thought his size gave him absolute authority over my life. He believed he was the apex predator in the room. He did not realize he had just walked directly into a steel cage with a monster. I looked up at him. I did not reach for the pen. I asked him a simple question. I asked if Richard Gallagher actually read the property deeds before he claimed to own this building. The thug frowned in deep confusion. He told me to shut up and sign the paper immediately. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up from the table. The three men tensed their muscles, expecting me to put up a desperate fight. I ignored their posturing completely. I walked over to the heavy wooden cabinet in the corner of my living room. I opened the bottom drawer, which was secured with a hidden biometric lock. It was filled with critical corporate files and heavy legal folders. I reached inside and pulled out a single, thick, red binder. It had the official gold seal of the state of Illinois stamped directly on the heavy cover. I walked back to the kitchen table and dropped the massive binder right on top of Megan's pathetic legal document. The loud slap of the heavy binder hitting the table made the thugs flinch backward. I opened the cover and turned directly to the first page. I looked the scarred man dead in the eyes and told him to read the name printed on the master property deed. He looked down at the paper with extreme hesitation. His eyes slowly scanned the complex legal jargon until he finally found the official ownership block. The building was absolutely not owned by Richard Gallagher's property management company. It was wholly owned by Horizon Group Holdings. I watched his aggressive face change as he read the name of the sole chairman and majority shareholder of Horizon Group. The name printed in bold black ink was Calvin Brooks. My name. I told the men in a cold, flat voice that Richard Gallagher did not own this building. I told them I owned this building. I told them I also owned the 14 surrounding apartment complexes in this entire residential district. I bought them all in cash 7 years ago through my private trust. The thug stared at the paper in total and complete disbelief. His cruel, confident smile completely vanished from his face. The color rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sick. He looked from the master deed to my face, and then back to the deed. His small brain could not comprehend how the poor old man in the cheap corduroy jacket was actually his ultimate landlord. I told him he had just violently kicked down the front door of a multi-million-dollar property owner. I told him breaking and entering into my private residence was a severe federal felony. I informed him that my hidden security cameras had already recorded their faces and transmitted the high-definition footage directly to my legal team. The scarred man took a slow, trembling step back from the table. The false confidence he carried just moments ago was completely shattered. He realized he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. He realized he was not threatening a helpless victim who would cry for mercy. He was threatening a powerful man who could destroy his entire life and send him to prison with a single phone call. I pointed a steady finger toward the broken wooden door. I told them to get out of my building before I had my private security team arrest them for criminal extortion and severe property damage. The three massive men did not dare to say another word. They scrambled awkwardly over the broken wood and ran down the hallway like terrified children fleeing from a ghost. They left the manila folder and the black pen sitting untouched on my table. I closed the red binder and calmly put it back in the secure cabinet. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Those thugs were going to run straight back to their boss, Richard Gallagher. They were going to tell him the terrifying truth about the old man he had been mocking for years. The news of my true corporate identity was about to hit the Gallagher estate like a massive destructive earthquake. They were finally going to realize the sheer magnitude of the enemy they had foolishly created. 2 hours after the thugs fled my apartment, there was a sharp professional knock on my door. It was Bradley Foster. My lead attorney stepped into the small living room, brushing light snow from the shoulders of his tailored charcoal suit. He did not remark on the splintered doorframe or the mess on the floor. Bradley was a man who only cared about numbers and legal leverage. He walked directly to my kitchen table and set his sleek leather briefcase down. He clicked the brass locks open and pulled out a single thick document. He placed it carefully on the wooden table right where the thugs had left their pathetic extortion paper. This document was entirely different. It carried the heavy, embossed red seal of a major national bank on the front cover. I sat down in my wooden chair and put on my reading glasses. The room was perfectly quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I stared at the top page of the heavy stack. It was a commercial loan guarantee agreement. The principal amount listed at the very top in bold black ink was exactly $10 million. The primary borrower was listed as Gallagher Commercial Properties. But that was not what made the air in the room turn ice cold. My eyes slowly moved to the bottom of the final page to the guarantor's signature line. There, written in bright blue ink, was my name, Calvin Brooks. It was an almost perfect forgery. The loops and angles were carefully practiced to mimic my exact handwriting. Someone had used my private corporate identity to secure a massive financial lifeline for Richard Gallagher's sinking empire. They had pledged my hidden assets as collateral without my knowledge. They had tried to steal my life. I looked up at Bradley. His face was completely stoic, but his eyes showed a deep, calculating anger. He told me his team discovered the document buried inside a routine audit of the Gallagher financial files we had acquired earlier that week. He explained exactly how the crime happened. 6 months ago, Richard Gallagher was on the verge of total bankruptcy. Traditional banks had completely cut off his corporate credit because of his terrible financial mismanagement. He desperately needed $10 million in liquid cash to keep his commercial real estate projects from collapsing into dust. He knew Terrence had access to my private mail and some of my personal banking documents. Terrence always thought those documents belonged to a senile old man pretending to be important. He did not know the shell companies listed on those papers were actually backed by billions of dollars in liquid capital. Richard and Terrence conspired together in secret. Terrence stole my financial statements and forged my signature on the guarantee document. He sold out his own father's name to buy the approval of his wealthy father-in-law. He risked my entire livelihood to keep Megan living in a world of luxury and designer clothes. I traced the blue ink of the forged signature with my index finger. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal settled deep into my bones. Terrence had not just disrespected me at a Thanksgiving dinner party. He had actively committed massive corporate fraud against me. He had weaponized my identity for his own selfish gain. He believed he was incredibly clever. He thought he could secretly use my credit profile to save the Gallagher empire, and that I would die in this cheap apartment before I ever found out the truth. He treated my name like a disposable tool to be used and thrown away. He had crossed the permanent line from being an ungrateful son to being a ruthless criminal. The pain of the realization was sharp, but it only lasted for a fraction of a second. I pushed the pain down into a dark locked box inside my mind. Emotion has absolutely no place in high-level business. Emotion makes you weak and vulnerable. I was not weak. I was the executioner preparing the blade. Bradley tapped his expensive gold pen against his leather notebook. He laid out the legal strategy with ruthless efficiency. He told me we had a slam-dunk case for federal wire fraud and identity theft. He said we could call the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately and have Terrence dragged out of his luxury home in handcuffs by dinner time. He promised me Terrence would face a minimum of 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He told me Richard Gallagher would be charged as a co-conspirator and his entire company would be seized by the government. Bradley wanted to unleash the authorities and let the justice system crush them both. I shook my head slowly. I told Bradley that sending them to federal prison right now was far too easy. Prison would give them a comfortable bed and 3 free meals a day paid for by the taxpayers. If the government seized the company, I would get nothing but a long, messy trial and endless paperwork. I wanted something much more painful. I wanted absolute control over their reality. I looked at the $10 million loan document. I told Bradley that since my signature was already on the paper, we were going to officially adopt the debt. I instructed him to have Horizon Group silently purchase the $10 million note from the bank at a premium price. I wanted to become Richard Gallagher's direct master. I wanted to own the very debt that was desperately keeping his company alive. Once we controlled the note, we would instantly call it in. We would demand the full $10 million immediately, citing the fraudulent signature as a massive breach of contract. But we would not go to the police. We would use the threat of federal prison to force Richard to sign over every single share of his company directly to me. I told Bradley I did not want to simply destroy the Gallagher empire. I wanted to swallow it whole. I wanted Megan and Terrence to watch helplessly as I legally consumed the very wealth they worshipped. Bradley slowly smiled. He understood the brutal beauty of the plan. It was not just justice. It was a complete financial execution. Bradley opened his laptop and began typing rapidly on the keyboard. Within 45 minutes, the hostile acquisition papers were completely drafted and legally binding. The trap was perfectly set and the steel jaws were ready to snap shut. I did not want to send this message through a simple email or a coward phone call. I wanted to look my enemy directly in the eyes when I delivered the crushing blow. I instructed Bradley to print the demand letter and place it inside a heavy black envelope. I knew exactly where Richard Gallagher spent his Tuesday afternoons. He was always holding court at the Oak Brook Executive Golf Club, acting like a king among his wealthy peers. I put my worn-out corduroy jacket back on and took the black envelope from Bradley. I told him to have the corporate security team stand by on high alert. The time for hiding in the shadows was completely over. I stepped out of my apartment and walked down the stairs to my old Ford. I was driving straight into the heart of their elite world. Richard Gallagher thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a weak opponent. He was about to find out I owned the entire board. The Oak Brook Executive Golf Club was a fortress of old money and arrogant privilege. It was the kind of place where millionaires made handshake deals over expensive scotch and laughed at the rest of the world. I drove my old Ford right up to the front entrance, ignoring the confused look of the valet. I handed him the keys and walked straight through the heavy glass doors. I was still wearing the same worn-out corduroy jacket I wore to the Thanksgiving dinner. The lobby was lined with dark mahogany wood and portraits of wealthy white men. The air smelled like expensive cigars and pure entitlement. As I walked toward the private dining patio, conversations around me suddenly stopped. Wealthy men and women in tailored golf attire turned to stare at me. Their eyes were filled with judgment and disgust. They wondered how an old black man had managed to sneak past the front gate. The club was a sanctuary where they hid from the consequences of the real world. I was the reality they tried so hard to avoid. A server in a crisp white uniform tried to step in my way to ask for my membership card, but I walked right past him without breaking my stride. I scanned the outdoor patio until I found my target. Richard Gallagher was sitting at a premium corner table overlooking the 18th hole. He was surrounded by 3 other local real estate developers smoking a thick Cuban cigar and laughing loudly. He looked completely relaxed and untouchable. He had absolutely no idea the grim reaper of his financial life was walking directly toward his table. I approached his group with slow, deliberate steps. The men at the table noticed my arrival, and their laughter immediately died down. Richard looked up at me, and his face twisted into a mask of pure annoyance. He thought I was there to beg for forgiveness just like Terrence had promised. Richard took the cigar out of his mouth and sneered at me. He loudly asked me if I was lost or if I was there to apply for a job cutting the grass. His friends chuckled at the racist insult. I did not smile. I did not show an ounce of anger. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out the heavy black envelope Bradley Foster had prepared. I dropped it right into the center of their table, knocking over Richard's crystal glass of scotch. The expensive liquor spilled across the white linen tablecloth. Richard jumped up from his chair, his face turning red with sudden rage. He yelled at me, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. I told him to open the envelope. I kept my voice incredibly low and calm, making the contrast with his screaming even more powerful. I told him the document inside was the only thing standing between him and a federal prison cell. Richard hesitated for a second before his arrogance took over. He ripped the envelope open and pulled out the legal demand letter. His eyes quickly scanned the first few lines. I watched the blood completely drain from his face. The aggressive posture he held a moment ago evaporated. I told him exactly what he was reading so his rich friends could hear every single word. I announced that I was the sole owner of Horizon Group. I told him I had just purchased his $10 million commercial loan directly from the bank. I pointed to the copy of the forged guarantee agreement attached to the back of the demand letter. I told Richard I knew all about his secret deal with Terrence. I knew they had forged my signature to fraudulently secure the capital he desperately needed to save his failing company. I explained that because the loan was secured through severe corporate fraud, the terms were officially breached. Every single property in his portfolio was now legally vulnerable. His luxury apartment buildings, his shopping centers, and his corporate headquarters were all tied to the fraudulent collateral. I called the entire note due immediately. I told him he had exactly 48 hours to wire $10 million directly to my trust account. If the money was not in my account by Thursday afternoon, I would hand the forgery evidence over to the FBI and personally seize every single asset his company owned. Richard stared at the paper in absolute horror. For a brief second, he looked like a terrified child, but his massive ego refused to let him accept defeat in front of his wealthy peers. He slammed his fist on the table and forced a loud, artificial laugh. He pointed his finger directly at my face and told his friends I was a delusional old man suffering from dementia. He claimed the documents were completely fake and that I was just a bitter father-in-law trying to cause a scene. He leaned across the table, invading my personal space. He whispered violently that I was nothing but a pathetic street hustler trying to extort a legitimate businessman. He spat the words at me, trying to provoke a violent reaction. He told me people like me could never touch people like him. He said he had the best corporate lawyers in the entire state of Illinois, and they would crush me into dust before the weekend. He boasted about his powerful political connections and the judges he played golf with. He firmly believed the legal system belonged entirely to him and that it would automatically protect him from a man who looked like me. He raised his hand and aggressively snapped his fingers at the club manager who was nervously watching from the doorway. Richard ordered the manager to call the police and have me arrested for trespassing and harassment. He demanded that security drag me out of the club by my neck. 2 large security guards in dark suits began rushing across the patio toward us. Richard stood tall, crossing his arms over his chest, completely confident that he had easily won the confrontation. He thought throwing me out of his exclusive country club would magically make the $10 million debt disappear. He thought his money and his social status gave him an invisible shield against the consequences of his own criminal actions. I did not move a single muscle as the guards approached. I simply looked at Richard with a cold, dead stare. I told him his expensive lawyers could not save him from a forged document carrying his own signature and a paper trail leading directly to his bank account. The security guards reached the table and grabbed my arms. I forcefully pulled my arms away from their grip. I told them I was leaving on my own. I straightened my corduroy jacket and looked Richard in the eyes one final time. I told him the clock was ticking and that 48 hours went by much faster than he thought. I turned my back on him and walked out of the club with my head held high. I left the black envelope sitting on the ruined white tablecloth. The moment I was out of sight, Richard's fake confidence completely shattered. He ignored the confused questions from his friends. His hands were shaking violently as he pulled his phone from his pocket. He immediately dialed Terrence. He knew he could never raise $10 million in 2 days. He needed a dirty alternative to make the debt vanish entirely. He ordered Terrence to execute the ultimate betrayal. He told my son they needed to legally declare me insane before Thursday. If I was locked inside a psychiatric ward and stripped of my legal rights, the demand letter would be completely nullified. He told Terrence to file the conservatorship papers first thing in the morning. They were going to steal my freedom to save their empire. The most ruthless attack of my life was about to begin. The sun had not even begun to rise over the freezing Chicago skyline when the aggressive pounding on my front door started. It was exactly 6 o'clock on Wednesday morning. The temporary wooden brace I had installed to secure the door frame rattled violently against the heavy strikes. I was already awake, sitting in the dark living room drinking my morning tea. I knew Richard Gallagher was a desperate man, but I did not expect him to move this quickly. The heavy door was forced open with a loud crack. 2 uniformed police officers rushed into my small apartment, shining blinding tactical flashlights directly into my eyes. Right behind them was a stern-looking woman wearing a thick winter coat and holding a metal clipboard. She introduced herself as an emergency social worker from the State Department of Mental Health. She spoke to me in a slow, condescending tone as if I were a confused toddler. She announced that they had a court order to detain me for an involuntary psychiatric evaluation. The officers kept their hands firmly on their duty belts, treating me like a highly dangerous and unpredictable threat. They scanned my modest living room, looking for weapons or signs of severe madness. I did not raise my hands or shout in protest. I simply sat in my chair and let the blinding lights wash over me. I asked the social worker to show me the legal warrant. She pulled a thick stack of papers from her clipboard and handed them to me. The harsh glare of the flashlights illuminated the signature at the very bottom of the petition. The name signed on the sworn legal affidavit was Terrence Brooks. My own flesh and blood had signed the document authorizing the state to drag me out of my home like an animal. I read through the emergency petition while the police officers stood over me with their shoulders tense. The lies printed on those legal pages were nothing short of extraordinary. Terrence had meticulously crafted a narrative designed to strip me of every single human right I possessed. He claimed I was suffering from advanced dementia and severe paranoid schizophrenia. He wrote that I had completely lost touch with reality and that my mental state was rapidly deteriorating. He explicitly stated that I was experiencing massive delusions of grandeur. He told the court that I was wandering around the city falsely claiming to be a billionaire real estate mogul. He used the confrontation at the golf club as primary evidence. He claimed I had violently harassed his father-in-law and threatened to steal $10 million using fabricated corporate documents. He even claimed that the old car I drove was stolen and that I was hoarding dangerous items in my apartment to wage a war against the wealthy elite. He crafted a masterpiece of absolute fiction designed to trigger an immediate state emergency response. Terrence painted a picture of a pathetic, sick old man who was a direct physical danger to himself and to his family. To make the lie completely bulletproof, he brought up my grandson Leo. He swore under oath that I had threatened to harm the child. Just as I finished reading the horrible accusations, Terrence himself walked through my broken doorway. He was dressed in a conservative gray suit, looking the part of a deeply concerned and exhausted son. He put his hand over his mouth and let out a fake, tragic sigh when he looked at me. He turned to the social worker and thanked her for responding so quickly. He played the role of the grieving child perfectly. He told the officers that his father had been a good man, but that my mind was completely gone. He said it broke his heart to do this, but he had to protect society from my violent outbursts. He looked directly into my eyes and tried to project an image of sorrow, but underneath the fake sadness I could see the vicious, arrogant smirk of a man who thought he had just won the ultimate victory. Terrence truly believed he had executed a flawless masterstroke. He thought that by throwing me into a locked psychiatric ward, he could magically erase the $10 million debt and invalidate the foreclosure of the Gallagher empire. If I was legally declared insane by the state, my signature on the demand letter would be completely worthless. My corporate authority would be suspended, and Terrence would automatically be appointed as my legal guardian. He would gain total control over my life, my medical decisions, and my finances. It was an incredibly evil and calculated move. The police officers stepped forward and ordered me to stand up. They told me I needed to come with them to the county hospital right now. They warned me that if I resisted, they would be forced to use physical restraints. Most men in my position would have panicked. Most men would have screamed about their innocence and yelled that their son was a liar. But screaming is exactly what crazy people do. If I raised my voice or fought back, I would instantly prove Terrence's accusations to be true. The social worker was holding her pen ready to document any sign of aggression or instability. I refused to give them the satisfaction. He desperately needed me to scream. He needed me to fight the police so he could validate his narrative and feel justified in his horrific betrayal. By refusing to fight, I denied him the validation he craved. I slowly stood up from my wooden chair and smoothed the wrinkles out of my pants. I walked over to the coat rack and calmly put on my heavy winter jacket. I turned to the police officers and held both of my wrists out in front of me. I told them I was completely willing to cooperate with their medical evaluation. I told them they could use the handcuffs if it made them feel safer. The officers looked confused by my total compliance, but they quickly snapped the cold metal cuffs around my wrists anyway. The metal cuffs bit into my skin, but I felt absolutely no pain. My mind was already 5 steps ahead of his pathetic little scheme. I walked past Terrence without saying a single word. I did not curse his name. I did not look at him with hatred. My absolute silence unsettled him. His arrogant smirk faltered for a brief second as I was escorted out the door. He thought he had broken my spirit. He thought my silence was the ultimate sign of defeat. The police officers guided me down the snowy steps of my apartment building and pushed me into the back seat of their cruiser. The heavy metal door slammed shut, locking me inside the dark cage. Through the cold glass window, I watched Terrence standing on the porch talking to the social worker. He was shaking her hand and smiling warmly, playing his part until the very end. The police car pulled away from the curb, the tires crunching loudly against the fresh snow. I leaned my head back against the hard plastic seat and let out a long, slow breath. I was entirely at peace. Terrence was a fool who operated on pure arrogance. He did not realize that my silence was not surrender. It was strategy. Back inside my empty apartment, sitting quietly underneath the kitchen table, was a small black digital recording device. It was the exact same device that had been running continuously since the moment Terrence called me screaming from the Porsche dealership. The moment the police car crossed the city limits, the hidden device automatically finished its daily backup cycle. Every single word of Terrence's violent threats and his brutal extortion attempts was instantly uploaded to a secure, encrypted cloud server. Bradley Foster was already downloading the high-definition audio files to his secure corporate computer. The ultimate trap was fully armed and ready to execute. The county hospital psychiatric ward was a sterile cage painted in depressing shades of pale green. The air smelled of strong industrial bleach and stale coffee. The heavy steel doors locked behind me with a loud mechanical clank. The police officers handed my custody over to the ward nurses and quickly left to answer another call. I was escorted down a long, fluorescent-lit hallway into a small, windowless examination room. The room was furnished with nothing but a cold metal desk and two uncomfortable plastic chairs bolted to the floor. I sat down and waited in complete silence for 20 long minutes. Finally, the heavy wooden door opened, and a tall man in a crisp white lab coat walked inside. His name tag read, Dr. Gregory Pierce. He did not look at me when he sat down. He did not ask me how I was feeling or conduct any basic medical checks. He did not treat me like a human being. He simply opened a thick yellow medical folder and pulled out the official state commitment forms. He already had his expensive silver fountain pen uncapped. It was incredibly obvious that Terrence and Richard had reached him first. The Gallagher family had deep pockets, and they clearly used their dirty money to buy this doctor's medical ethics. Dr. Pierce kept his eyes glued to the paperwork, treating me like a minor administrative inconvenience. He began speaking in a rapid, highly rehearsed tone. He told me he had extensively reviewed the emergency petition filed by my son. He said the evidence of my severe psychological delusions was absolutely overwhelming. He stated that for my own safety and the safety of the public, he was officially authorizing a mandatory 30-day psychiatric hold in a state facility. He casually mentioned that the family court would appoint Terrence as my permanent legal guardian by the end of the week. He pressed the sharp tip of his expensive pen against the bottom signature line of the form, ready to sign away the rest of my natural life with a single stroke. I did not let the ink touch the paper. I reached across the cold metal desk and placed my large hand firmly over the signature line. Dr. Pierce finally looked up at me, his face flashing with sudden arrogant irritation. He opened his mouth to order me to sit back down and obey his authority, but the cold, dead look in my eyes made him freeze mid-sentence. I slowly pulled my hand away from the legal document. I unbuttoned the inside pocket of my worn corduroy jacket. The police officers had patted me down for weapons, but they did not care about folded pieces of paper. I pulled out a small, tightly bound stack of financial documents. These were not the massive corporate files I kept in my secure cabinet at home. These were highly specific, highly damaging transaction records. My corporate intelligence team had pulled these exact records directly from the Gallagher corporate servers just 3 hours before my arrest. I unfolded the papers and laid them completely flat across the metal desk, completely covering the doctor's fraudulent commitment forms. Dr. Pierce frowned in deep confusion. He looked down at the top sheet of paper. It was an international wire transfer log showing massive amounts of money moving from Gallagher commercial properties into offshore shell companies located in the Cayman Islands. I tapped my index finger heavily against a specific highlighted line on the second page. It was a direct payment of $50,000 routed through a fake medical consulting firm directly into Dr. Pierce's personal offshore bank account. The digital transaction was dated exactly 3 days ago. The doctor stared at the highlighted line in absolute shock. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like wet chalk. His breathing suddenly became shallow and erratic as panic set in. He looked at me with absolute terror in his eyes. He realized the old black man sitting across from him was not a delusional patient suffering from dementia. I was the architect of his impending destruction. I told him he had made a catastrophic error in judgment by taking a dirty bribe from Richard Gallagher. I told him the financial records currently sitting on his desk were already backed up on a secure server constantly monitored by federal investigators. I carefully explained that aiding in the fraudulent seizure of a multi-billion-dollar corporate entity carried a mandatory federal prison sentence of 20 years. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I spoke with the calm, mechanical precision of a judge reading a final death sentence. I told Dr. Pierce that Richard and Terrence were currently the primary targets of an active investigation for massive corporate bank fraud. I explained exactly how they had forged my legal signature on a $10 million commercial loan to artificially save their failing real estate empire. I told him I had personally bought that exact debt through my private trust and initiated a hostile corporate takeover of their entire company just yesterday. I watched the doctor's eyes widen in sheer panic as the true scale of the situation finally crashed down heavily on his shoulders. He realized he was not just helping a rich elite family quietly lock away a problematic grandfather. He was actively participating in a desperate criminal conspiracy to cover up massive federal bank fraud. I leaned slightly forward over the metal desk, invading his personal space and trapping him in his chair. I told him that Terrence desperately needed me declared legally insane today, so my signature on the corporate demand letter would be automatically invalidated by a judge. I told Dr. Pierce that by signing that psychiatric commitment form, he was officially tying his prestigious medical license and his personal freedom to a rapidly sinking ship. I asked him if $50,000 was really worth spending the rest of his natural life eating off a metal tray in a federal penitentiary. The doctor began to sweat profusely. A single heavy drop of perspiration rolled down the side of his face and dropped onto his crisp white collar. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped his expensive silver fountain pen onto the hard tile floor. It rolled under the metal desk, completely forgotten. He desperately tried to form words, but his throat was too dry to speak. He stammered and choked, trying to explain that he did not know the full story behind the money. He claimed Richard Gallagher had completely lied to him about the circumstances. He swore under his breath that he thought he was actually helping a sick old man get proper medical treatment. I cut his pathetic rambling off immediately. I told him his weak excuses would not save him in a federal courtroom in front of a ruthless prosecutor. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to make a choice that would permanently determine the rest of his natural life. He could either sign the commitment paper and go down with the Gallagher family, or he could destroy the documents and walk away from this criminal conspiracy right now. Dr. Pierce did not even need the full 10 seconds to make his final decision. Pure primal self-preservation completely overpowered his pathetic greed. He violently grabbed the state commitment forms from the metal desk and tore them straight down the middle. He ripped the thick yellow papers again and again in a frantic panic until they were nothing but a pile of useless confetti scattered across the desk surface. He frantically shoved the $50,000 wire transfer record back toward me as if the paper itself was burning his skin. He stood up from his plastic chair, his knees physically shaking under his weight. He stammered a frantic apology and loudly declared that I was in perfect mental health. He promised he would immediately log my psychological evaluation as completely sound and release me from the hospital hold without any further delay. He swore he would never speak to Richard Gallagher or Terrence ever again for as long as he lived. I gathered my financial documents and placed them securely back inside my jacket pocket. I stood up from the desk and smoothed out the wrinkles in my clothes. I walked out of the sterile examination room without looking back, leaving the broken, corrupt doctor to clean up his own miserable mess. The psychiatric hold was officially terminated. Terrence's ultimate master plan had completely collapsed into dust right before his eyes. I walked down the long, fluorescent hallway, past the confused ward nurses, and straight out the front doors of the county hospital. The freezing winter air hit my face and felt incredibly refreshing. I pulled out my phone and dialed my lawyer, Bradley Foster. I told him the final obstacle had been completely removed from the board. It was time to file the massive countersuit for criminal extortion and execute the total financial annihilation of the Gallagher empire. Thursday evening arrived with a cold, biting wind, but inside the grand ballroom of the Gallagher Plaza, the atmosphere was electric and warm. I sat quietly in my small apartment watching the entire event unfold on a live high-definition news feed on my computer screen. Megan was the absolute center of attention. She stood gracefully on a highly illuminated stage wearing a custom silk gown that cost more than most people earned in a year. This was the official launch party for the crown jewel of her father's empire. It was a massive luxury commercial development called The Pinnacle. Over 500 of the wealthiest investors, politicians, and socialites in Chicago were gathered in the room holding crystal flutes of imported champagne. Dozens of news cameras and social media influencers were broadcasting the event live to millions of viewers across the state. Megan loved the spotlight. She thrived on the envy of others. She stepped up to the crystal podium and adjusted the microphone with a perfectly manicured hand. A massive digital projector screen behind her displayed stunning architectural renderings of the new skyscrapers. She smiled brightly for the flashing cameras, completely oblivious to the financial hurricane that was currently accelerating toward her perfectly curated world. She truly believed her family was invincible. She thought her husband Terrence had successfully locked his poor, embarrassing father inside a psychiatric ward just as they had planned. She felt a deep sense of arrogant triumph. The unwanted old black man was gone forever, and her glorious future was completely secure. She took a deep breath and began her highly rehearsed speech to the eager crowd. Megan spoke passionately about the legacy of the Gallagher family. She boldly claimed that the Pinnacle would redefine the skyline of Chicago and generate billions of dollars in revenue for their elite investors. She proudly announced that the project was fully funded and moving into the immediate construction phase. She boasted about her own brilliant leadership and how she had personally overseen the acquisition of the prime real estate. She painted a picture of infinite wealth and absolute corporate dominance. The wealthy crowd applauded enthusiastically, hanging on to her every word. Terrence was standing in the front row wearing a velvet tuxedo, clapping the loudest and beaming with stolen pride. He looked incredibly relieved, thinking his massive forgery crime was safely buried under my fake medical records. Megan raised her glass of champagne to propose a toast to the unstoppable success of Gallagher Commercial Properties. But before the crystal glass could even reach her lips, the heavy mahogany doors at the very back of the ballroom violently burst open. The loud crash echoed through the massive hall, instantly killing the applause. The string quartet stopped playing in the middle of a note. Every single camera abruptly pivoted away from Megan and pointed straight toward the entrance. Walking down the center aisle with slow, purposeful strides was my lead attorney, Bradley Foster. He was flanked by the chief deputy sheriff of Cook County and 4 uniformed police officers. Bradley looked like a corporate grim reaper in his tailored black suit. He carried a thick leather briefcase, and his face was completely devoid of emotion. The crowd of elite socialites quickly parted ways, whispering in absolute shock. Terrence dropped his champagne glass onto the marble floor. It shattered into 100 tiny pieces. He stared at Bradley with his mouth wide open, his velvet tuxedo suddenly feeling like a suffocating straitjacket. He knew exactly who Bradley was, and he knew exactly what his presence meant. The psychiatric hold had completely failed. The truth was marching directly toward the stage. Megan glared at the officers with pure venom. She leaned into the microphone and angrily demanded to know the meaning of this outrageous interruption. She screamed that this was a private corporate event and ordered security to throw the intruders out immediately. Bradley did not even flinch at her screeching voice. He walked directly up the plush carpeted stairs and stepped onto her perfect stage. The chief deputy sheriff followed closely behind him, holding a large rolled-up piece of heavy legal paper. Bradley walked straight to the crystal podium, completely ignoring Megan's furious demands. He turned to face the hundreds of confused investors and the blinking red lights of the live news cameras. He spoke with a loud, clear, and absolutely commanding voice that cut through the tension in the room. He announced that he was the legal representative for Horizon Group, the senior debt holder of Gallagher Commercial Properties. He declared that effective immediately, the entire Gallagher corporate portfolio was in default due to massive federal bank fraud and the use of forged collateral documents. The ballroom erupted into chaotic gasps. Megan turned pale, her eyes wide with sheer panic. She tried to grab the microphone back, but the sheriff stepped firmly between her and Bradley. The sheriff unrolled the heavy paper and slapped a massive red emergency stop work order directly onto the glass surface of the crystal podium. He loudly announced that the land underneath the Pinnacle project was officially seized by the court. He stated that all construction was halted indefinitely. and that the property was now under the direct legal control of Horizon Group. He turned to the cameras and confirmed that Richard Gallagher was currently under active federal investigation for wire fraud and criminal forgery. The architectural renderings on the giant projector screen behind them suddenly flickered and died, replaced by a harsh blue error screen. The illusion of Gallagher wealth was instantly shattered in front of the entire world. Megan looked desperately at Terrence for help, but Terrence was physically backing away from the stage, trying to hide in the chaotic crowd. The investors who were cheering just minutes ago immediately began shouting angrily and pulling out their phones to call their brokers. Megan lost complete control of her carefully crafted image. She started screaming hysterically into the dead microphone, accusing Bradley of being a liar and a terrorist. She threw her expensive champagne flute across the stage in a violent tantrum. Her perfect silk gown tore at the seam as she wildly lunged toward the legal documents, trying to rip them apart. The police officers quickly restrained her, pulling her away from the podium as the cameras captured every single humiliating second of her total collapse. Within less than 5 minutes, the live broadcast had caused a massive financial earthquake. The stock price of Gallagher Commercial Properties began in free fall on the after-hours trading market. Millions of dollars in corporate value were evaporating into thin air with every passing second. Major investors were furiously dialing their financial managers, demanding to pull their capital out of the fraudulent company immediately. The empire Richard had built on lies and arrogance was burning to the ground on live television. Terrence managed to slip out the side door of the ballroom, sprinting into the cold night air like a cowardly rat fleeing a sinking ship. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, completely terrified of the total destruction surrounding him. He was about to make the most desperate and pathetic decision of his entire life. Less than an hour after the disastrous broadcast ended, my broken apartment door was violently kicked open for the second time this week. Terrence stumbled into my living room, breathing heavily and smelling of expensive champagne and cold sweat. His luxurious velvet tuxedo was completely ruined. The bow tie hung loosely around his neck, and his expensive leather shoes were soaked with dirty street snow. He looked wildly around the small room until his eyes locked onto me. I was sitting in my usual wooden chair drinking a fresh cup of tea. Terrence did not scream this time. He did not threaten to lock me in a hospital or have me arrested. Instead, he dramatically threw himself onto the hard wooden floor. He crawled across the worn rug and collapsed at my feet. He wrapped his arms around my knees and began to sob loudly. It was the most pathetic display of fake emotion I had ever witnessed in my entire life. He cried about how sorry he was for everything that had happened. He swore he never wanted to hurt me and claimed Richard Gallagher had forced him to sign the forged documents. He begged for my forgiveness with the desperate theatrical energy of a cornered animal. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, playing the role of the prodigal son returning home. He thought his crying would magically erase the fact that he had tried to strip away my human rights just 24 hours ago. He truly believed my fatherly instincts would overpower my logical mind. He expected me to reach down and comfort him. I did not move. I stared down at him with the cold, detached observation of a scientist watching a dying insect. Terrence realized his tears were not melting my heart, so he quickly shifted to his backup plan. He unbuttoned his ruined tuxedo jacket and reached into his inner pocket with trembling hands. He pulled out a crisp piece of paper and held it up to me like it was a holy artifact. It was a certified bank check. He proudly announced that the check was written for exactly $500,000. He told me it was a personal peace offering from him and Megan to make up for all the misunderstandings. His voice was frantic and thick with desperation as he tried to negotiate his way out of a federal crime. He begged me to call Bradley Foster and cancel the public foreclosure of the Pinnacle project. He pleaded with me to withdraw the demand letter and drop the fraud allegations against the Gallagher family. He promised that if I took the money, I would never have to worry about paying rent in this cheap neighborhood ever again. He swore he would bring my grandson Leo to visit me every single weekend, and that we could finally be a real family. He was trying to buy his own father off with a fraction of the wealth I had secretly accumulated. He spoke as if $500,000 was an unimaginable fortune that would instantly blind me to his vicious betrayal. He completely ignored the fact that my private company had just purchased a $10 million loan in cash. In his arrogant mind, I was still just a poor old man who could be easily bribed and silenced with a flashy piece of paper. He pushed the check closer to my face, desperately waiting for me to grab it. He firmly believed every single person in the world had a price, and he thought he had finally found mine. He told me we needed to stick together as father and son to protect the family legacy. He actually dared to use the word legacy after he had forged my name and tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward. He told me Megan was willing to publicly apologize on television if that was what I wanted. He promised Richard Gallagher would step down and let Terrence run the company so we could build an empire together. He painted a ridiculous fantasy where the three of us would share the stolen wealth and live happily ever after. I listened to his pathetic bargaining without blinking. I slowly reached out and took the certified check from his shaking fingers. Terrence let out a massive sigh of relief, thinking he had successfully purchased his salvation. His fake tears instantly stopped, and the arrogant smirk began to creep back onto his face. I held the check up to the dim light of the living room, inspecting the signature. Then I placed my hands on opposite ends of the paper and ripped it straight down the middle. Terrence gasped in horror as I tore the pieces again and again until the $500,000 bribe was nothing but tiny shreds of trash. I opened my hand and let the paper snow fall directly onto his upturned face. I leaned forward and told him he was insulting my intelligence. I told him I knew exactly where that money came from. I explained that I had my financial intelligence team tracking his personal accounts for the past 3 years. I leaned closer and recited a highly specific number to him. I told him he currently owed exactly $420,000 to an illegal sports gambling syndicate operating out of a casino in Atlantic City. I told him I knew he had been secretly draining Megan's personal trust fund for months to cover his massive gambling losses and keep the bookies from breaking his legs. Terrence froze completely. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He had kept his gambling addiction an absolute secret from Megan and Richard. He realized I held the power to destroy his marriage with a single phone call. The fake facade of the loving son completely shattered into a million pieces. Terrence's face twisted into a mask of pure demonic rage. He scrambled to his feet and stood over me, clenching his fists. He began screaming vicious curses at the top of his lungs. He called me a monster. He yelled that I was a bitter, jealous old man trying to ruin his life because I had never achieved anything on my own. He threatened to kill me with his bare hands right there in my living room. He kicked my kitchen table so hard it cracked down the center. He spat on my floor and promised he would make sure I died a painful, lonely death. His rage was totally uncontrolled. He was completely unhinged and screaming like a madman, showing the exact psychiatric behavior he had falsely accused me of having. I sat perfectly still and let him exhaust his violent temper. When his screaming finally reduced to heavy panting, I calmly pointed my finger toward my closed bedroom door. The handle slowly turned and the heavy wooden door swung open. Bradley Foster stepped out into the living room holding his leather briefcase. Right behind him was a uniformed state process server holding a professional digital video camera. The red recording light was blinking steadily in the dim apartment. They had been standing quietly inside my dark bedroom the entire time, listening to every single word. I looked at Terrence and told him the state of Illinois required 2 independent witnesses to officially document criminal extortion and felony bribery. I thanked him for providing such a clear and aggressive confession on high-definition video. Terrence stared at the camera lens in absolute silence. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The realization of his fatal mistake hit him like a freight train. He had just handed me the final nail for his own coffin. I told Bradley to add the new charges to the federal indictment. Terrence slowly backed out of the apartment, his eyes wide with pure terror, completely trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The morning after Terrence fled my apartment, the silence was broken by a sharp, heavy knock on my door. It was barely 8 o'clock. I opened the door to find a man in a cheap brown suit holding a thick manila envelope. He did not introduce himself. He simply asked if I was Calvin Brooks. When I nodded, he shoved the envelope directly into my chest and walked away down the hall without looking back. I closed the door and tore the envelope open. Inside was a stack of legal documents bearing the official seal of the family court. It was a temporary restraining order. Megan had executed her final desperate retaliation. She knew her father's company was completely collapsing, and she knew Terrence was facing federal prison. Since she could no longer attack my bank account, she decided to attack my heart. The legal petition was a masterpiece of absolute pure malice. Megan had sworn under penalty of perjury that I had physically struck my 5-year-old grandson Leo during the Thanksgiving dinner. She claimed I was a violent, unstable man with a history of unpredictable rage. She formally requested that I be banned from coming within 500 feet of her child, her home, and her son's school. The judge had signed the emergency order immediately based entirely on her fabricated statements. She was using her own child as a human shield and a weapon of mass emotional destruction. I walked over to my kitchen table and spread the legal pages out across the wood. The words printed on the paper felt like physical blades cutting into my chest. This was the most vicious and cowardly blow of the entire war. Leo was the only pure and innocent thing left in my bloodline. He was a bright, happy little boy who loved playing with the wooden toy trains I bought him for his birthday. He had absolutely no idea how deeply rotten his parents were. The thought of Megan telling him terrible lies about his grandfather made my stomach turn. I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of grief threaten to pull me under. Any normal man would have broken down crying. Any normal grandfather would have rushed to the courthouse screaming about his innocence and begging to see his grandson. But Megan was counting on that exact emotional reaction. She wanted me to lose control so she could use my panic as proof of my instability. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath. I visualized the pain inside my chest and deliberately pushed it down into the dark, cold box in my mind. The grief instantly crystallized into solid, impenetrable ice. Megan thought she was punishing me, but she had just made the most fatal miscalculation of her entire life. By weaponizing Leo, she had completely severed the very last invisible thread of mercy holding me back. I stood alone in the quiet apartment and looked down at my hands. They were perfectly steady. I did not shed a single tear. Crying is for people who have run out of options. I had an entire arsenal at my disposal. I realized in that exact moment that Terrence and Megan were not just greedy and arrogant. They were a highly toxic disease. If I allowed them to keep their wealth and their social status, they would eventually infect Leo with their cruelty. They would teach him to judge people by the clothes they wore and the cars they drove. They would turn a sweet, innocent boy into a ruthless monster just like them. To save the child, I had to completely amputate the infected parents. The time for measured responses and targeted corporate strikes was officially over. I was no longer trying to teach them a lesson about respect. I was going to surgically remove every single pillar of their comfortable existence until they had absolutely nothing left but the clothes on their backs. I carefully folded the restraining order and placed it inside my jacket pocket. It was not a defeat. It was the final legal justification I needed to execute the ultimate financial death blow. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to Bradley Foster. He answered on the first ring, already sitting at his desk at the law firm. I did not greet him. I gave him a single direct order. I told Bradley to initiate the total credit lockdown of the entire Gallagher corporate and personal network. I instructed him to freeze the master operating accounts, the payroll accounts, and every single revolving line of credit tied to their name. I told him to contact the federal banking regulators and submit the high-definition video of Terrence's extortion attempt directly to the lead investigator. The trap was no longer just snapping shut. It was crushing their bones into dust. Bradley confirmed the orders with a cold, professional tone and hung up the phone. By the time the sun fully rose over Chicago, the Gallagher family would not be able to buy a cup of coffee. The total financial blackout had officially begun. Richard Gallagher woke up on Friday morning inside his 12,000-square-foot mansion in the wealthy suburbs of Chicago. He was completely unaware that his entire empire had been financially decapitated while he slept. He put on his custom silk robe and walked down the grand, sweeping staircase to his massive state-of-the-art kitchen. He poured himself a cup of imported coffee and opened his laptop to check his personal bank accounts. He expected to see his usual 8-figure balances reflecting the extreme power and prestige he believed he was born to hold. Instead, the screen displayed a glaring red error message. His primary checking account was completely frozen. He frowned deeply and clicked on his corporate platinum card portal. The screen flashed a massive access denied warning. He picked up his gold-plated smartphone and dialed the private concierge number for his elite credit card company. The automated voice informed him that his account had been permanently suspended due to suspected fraudulent activity and a severe federal hold. Richard felt a sudden sharp pain in his chest. He immediately tried to access his backup accounts. He tried the secret offshore accounts he used to hide millions of dollars from the Internal Revenue Service. Every single login returned the exact same terrifying red message. Total account lockdown. His massive wealth had simply vanished overnight. He was a multimillionaire who suddenly did not have enough liquid cash to buy a single gallon of gas for his fleet of luxury cars. The financial bloodline of the Gallagher family was completely severed. Richard stood alone in his massive kitchen, staring at the blank computer screen in absolute and complete disbelief. Before Richard could even process the terrifying reality of his frozen personal accounts, his cell phone began to ring frantically. The caller ID showed the name of his chief corporate accountant, Arthur. Richard answered the phone with a trembling hand. Arthur was hyperventilating on the other end of the line, sounding like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. The accountant did not bother with formal greetings or respectful titles. He screamed that federal banking regulators had just raided their corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago. Arthur explained in a terrified voice that every single bank tied to Gallagher Commercial Properties had simultaneously pulled their funding at exactly 6 o'clock that morning. The banks had received an anonymous high-definition video showing Terrence attempting to bribe a hostile creditor. They had also received a massive data dump proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the $10 million commercial loan keeping the company afloat was secured with completely forged collateral documents. The banks immediately invoked their emergency default clauses to protect their capital. They instantly froze the master operating accounts, the vendor payment lines, and the entire corporate payroll system. Arthur cried loudly into the phone as he told Richard that over 500 construction workers and corporate employees would not receive their paychecks today. The entire labor force of the Gallagher empire was about to walk off their job sites and contact the local news stations. Richard gripped the cold marble kitchen counter so hard his knuckles turned white to keep from collapsing onto the floor. He yelled at Arthur, demanding to know how this massive data leak could possibly happen under his watch. Arthur sobbed heavily and told him the federal investigators were already seizing all the corporate hard drives and filing cabinets. The accountant said the federal agents were specifically looking for Richard and that they had a sealed warrant for his immediate arrest. Arthur abruptly hung up the phone, terrified of being implicated any further in the massive financial crime. Richard was left standing in total silence, listening to the dead dial tone of his gold-plated phone. The walls of his magnificent mansion suddenly felt like the cold steel bars of a federal prison cell closing in tightly around his neck. Panic completely overtook Richard's mind. He fiercely refused to accept that his powerful multi-generational dynasty was collapsing into dust before breakfast. He firmly believed this was a highly coordinated and vicious attack by a rival real estate developer trying to steal his prime commercial land at a steep discount. He ran out of the kitchen and sprinted into his private home office, locking the heavy wooden door behind him. He began making frantic phone calls to his most trusted political allies, his golf club friends, and his expensive defense attorneys. One by one, every single call went straight to voicemail. The wealthy elite of Chicago had already seen the disastrous news broadcast of Meghan screaming like a lunatic on stage. They knew Richard was now highly radioactive, and they were rapidly cutting all ties to save their own precious reputations. Richard finally managed to reach a junior partner at his external corporate law firm. The young lawyer spoke in a hushed, nervous tone, looking over his shoulder. He told Richard that the hostile takeover was being brilliantly orchestrated by a completely invisible corporate entity called the CB Investment Fund. The lawyer carefully explained that this unknown fund had legally purchased the fraudulent $10 million loan directly from the bank and had perfectly executed the financial trap overnight. Richard violently demanded to know the exact name of the chief executive officer running the CB Investment Fund. He screamed that he needed a physical name so he could hire private investigators to destroy their lives and burn their businesses to the ground. The young lawyer hesitated before explaining that the fund was heavily buried under thick layers of complex shell companies and strict ironclad privacy trusts. There was no public board of directors listed anywhere. There was no physical corporate address other than a highly secure post office box located in Delaware. The entity was an absolute financial ghost armed with billions of dollars in liquid capital. Richard paced furiously back and forth across his expensive Persian rug. He cursed the mysterious CB Investment Fund at the top of his lungs. He swore he would find the people responsible for this nightmare and crush them without a single ounce of mercy. He was completely consumed by his massive, arrogant ego. Richard violently hurled his gold-plated smartphone against the heavy brick fireplace in his office. The expensive device shattered into dozens of jagged pieces, scattering across the polished hardwood floor. He stood alone in the center of his lavish room, breathing heavily like a trapped wild animal, realizing there was no way out. His mind desperately raced through a long mental list of powerful enemies he had made over his decades of ruthless business dealings. He strongly suspected rival billionaires, hostile foreign investors, or angry politicians he had previously double-crossed. He completely and utterly failed to connect the simple initials CB to the old black man he had mercilessly mocked at the country club just a few short days ago. His deep-rooted racism and supreme-class arrogance completely blinded him to the absolute truth of his destruction. He simply could not fathom that Calvin Brooks possessed the supreme intellect or the massive financial resources to execute such a flawless corporate execution. He still thought I was just a pathetic grandfather mourning a lost relationship living in a cheap apartment. He had absolutely no idea that the man he had foolishly tried to lock inside a psychiatric ward was the exact same ghost currently crushing his throat. Megan was rapidly running out of time. Her father's massive corporate company was completely frozen, and federal investigators were circling their lives like starving vultures. By noon on Friday, she made a highly desperate attempt to salvage her own luxurious lifestyle. She called her elite real estate broker, a woman named Sylvia, and demanded an emergency meeting at the private mansion she shared with Terrence. The house was a sprawling, modern architectural marvel located in the most exclusive zip code in the entire state of Illinois. Megan paced the grand marble foyer in a state of absolute frantic panic. She was wearing expensive designer clothes, but her hair was messy and her eyes were bloodshot from crying furiously all night. She desperately needed liquid cash immediately to hire federal defense attorneys for her father and to protect her own personal assets from the impending government seizure. Sylvia arrived in a silver Mercedes, carrying a sleek tablet and a thick folder of listing agreements. Megan did not offer her a cup of coffee or a place to sit. She aggressively pointed at the expensive artwork on the walls and the custom furniture, demanding that the entire house be listed on the private market immediately. She told Sylvia she wanted an all-cash buyer by Monday morning and that she was completely willing to take a 20% loss just to get the money wired instantly. She was behaving exactly like a frantic gambler trying to pawn a stolen watch to pay off a deadly debt. She foolishly thought she could easily outsmart the federal financial freeze by liquidating her marital assets before the government realized what she was doing. She firmly believed the giant house was her ultimate, unbreakable safety net. Sylvia looked at Megan with deep professional concern. The real estate agent was highly experienced and knew that sudden fire sales of this extreme magnitude usually meant severe legal trouble. However, the massive commission on a $10 million home was far too tempting to pass up. Sylvia opened her digital tablet and logged into the secure county property database to officially verify the title and pull the current tax records. Megan stood directly over her shoulder, nervously biting her manicured nails and aggressively tapping her foot against the polished marble floor. Terrence was sitting alone on the living room sofa, staring blankly at the wall with a heavy glass of whiskey in his shaking hand. He had not slept a single minute since he fled my apartment the night before. He knew the walls were rapidly closing in, but he was too terrified to tell Megan about the shredded check or the high-definition video confession I had captured. He was completely paralyzed by his own pathetic cowardice. Sylvia typed the mansion address into the search bar and waited for the official county records to load on the screen. The page refreshed, displaying the master deed information. Sylvia instantly stopped typing. Her professional sales smile completely vanished from her face. She squinted at the bright screen, firmly believing she had made a typo. She refreshed the database page 3 separate times, but the legal information remained exactly the same. Megan grew highly impatient and loudly snapped at the agent, demanding to know what was taking so incredibly long. She yelled that time was running out and that she needed the listing agreement signed right this very second. Sylvia slowly looked up from the tablet. Her face was completely pale. She took a physical step back from Megan, instinctively distancing herself from the highly radioactive situation. She spoke in a quiet, trembling voice. She told Megan that she absolutely could not list the property for sale. She explained that the county database was showing a massive legal encumbrance attached directly to the master deed. Megan angrily snatched the tablet from the agent's hands, refusing to believe a single word she said. She stared at the screen, her eyes frantically scanning the bold red text at the top of the official property record. The reality of the financial situation was completely incomprehensible to her arrogant mind. The digital county record clearly showed that the property was no longer legally owned by Megan or Terrence. It had been officially seized and completely transferred to a third-party holding company just 2 hours ago. Megan screamed at the tablet, loudly claiming the government system was completely broken and threatening to sue the county clerk for incompetence. But the heavy legal notes attached to the file painted a devastatingly clear and unbreakable picture. The mansion had been quietly used as secondary collateral for the massive corporate loan Terrence had fraudulently guaranteed months ago. When my company called the $10 million note due and the Gallagher corporate accounts completely froze, the default clause automatically triggered the immediate seizure of all attached assets. Megan read the name of the new legal owner out loud. The screen clearly displayed the words Horizon Group Holdings. It was the exact same massive company that had publicly destroyed her father's empire on live television the night before. Megan dropped the tablet onto the hard marble floor. The glass screen cracked straight down the middle, mirroring her completely shattered reality. She suddenly realized that the invisible corporate monster systematically destroying her family had already anticipated her desperate escape plan. They had firmly locked the doors before she even realized the house was on fire. Sylvia quickly bent down, retrieved her broken tablet, and practically ran out the front door without saying another word. The real estate agent wanted absolutely nothing to do with a massive federal fraud investigation. Megan was left standing alone in the massive foyer, completely trapped. She had absolutely no money, no working credit cards, and now she did not even own the roof over her head. The grand illusion of her supreme wealth was entirely stripped away, leaving her completely naked to the harsh, brutal reality of her criminal actions. She turned slowly to look at Terrence sitting on the couch. The scattered pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap together in her mind. She remembered the secret, highly stressful financial meetings Terrence had with her father. She remembered him forging financial documents in his home office late at night. She suddenly realized that her own husband was the exact reason her entire world was completely collapsing. Megan marched across the large living room with pure murderous intent in her eyes. Terrence saw her coming and quickly tried to stand up from the sofa, holding his hands out defensively to stop her. He opened his mouth to make another pathetic, cowardly excuse, but he never got the chance to speak. Megan swung her arm back and violently slapped him across the face with all the strength she possessed. The sharp, loud crack echoed through the empty luxury mansion. Terrence stumbled backward, dropping his whiskey glass onto the expensive rug, where it shattered into pieces. Megan violently lunged at him, hitting his chest and screaming that he had completely ruined her entire life. She called him a worthless parasite and viciously blamed him for the total destruction of her father's company. Terrence violently pushed her away, his own deep fear instantly transforming into aggressive anger. He yelled back loudly, reminding her that he only committed the massive fraud to pay for her extravagant, greedy lifestyle. He told her she was a spoiled, useless brat who would be absolutely nothing without his constant sacrifices. The toxic alliance of extreme arrogance and greed was completely shattering. The rats were finally turning on each other and tearing themselves apart inside the rapidly sinking ship. Their perfect elite marriage was brutally exposed as a hollow business transaction that had just gone totally bankrupt. The grand luxury mansion that Megan and Terrence had proudly called their forever home was now a chaotic disaster zone. Expensive crystal vases and imported silk pillows were carelessly thrown into cheap cardboard boxes scattered across the living room floor. The reality of the immediate eviction notice had finally shattered the last remaining pieces of their fake, perfect life. Megan was frantically packing her designer bags, moving like a trapped animal desperate to salvage whatever luxury items she could physically carry. Terrence sat frozen on a leather armchair watching his entire universe collapse in real time. He looked pathetic with dark circles under his eyes and his hands shaking uncontrollably. Megan stopped packing and reached into her oversized leather tote bag. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents she had secretly ordered her private attorney to draft just hours ago. She marched directly over to the armchair and threw the heavy stack of papers right into Terrence's face. The sharp edges of the heavy paper cut his cheek as the documents scattered across his lap and onto the floor. It was a formal petition for absolute divorce. She did not shed a single tear. There was no sadness in her eyes, only pure, calculated survival instinct. She looked down at the man she had promised to love forever and saw nothing but a massive toxic liability dragging her down into the dirt. The marriage that was built entirely on a foundation of mutual greed and social climbing was officially terminating in the exact same cold and ruthless manner it began. The heavy paper bore the seal of the family court, demanding an immediate dissolution of the marriage. She was officially cutting her losses to save herself. Megan stood over Terrence with her hands aggressively planted on her hips. Her voice was sharp and filled with pure, unadulterated venom. She screamed that he was the most useless, pathetic excuse for a man she had ever met. She viciously reminded him that the only reason she married him was because she thought he was a rising star in the corporate world. Now she realized he was just a cowardly parasite who completely ruined her father's billion-dollar empire with his stupid, sloppy forgery. She aggressively blamed him for the frozen bank accounts, the terrifying federal investigations, and the humiliating loss of their luxury home. She told him he was going to rot in a federal prison cell and that she absolutely refused to let his criminal incompetence drag her down with him. Terrence tried to speak to beg her to stay and figure things out together, but she forcefully cut him off. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at his face and delivered the ultimate crushing blow. She told him she was immediately filing for sole legal and physical custody of their son, Leo. She declared that Terrence would never see his child again. She said she was going to take the boy move out of the state and change his last name so he would never be associated with the absolute disgrace of the Brooks family. She was ruthlessly using her own son as a legal shield to protect her remaining hidden assets from the impending government seizure. She knew that if she firmly painted Terrence as the sole criminal mastermind and completely cut ties, she might be able to convince the federal judges to spare her personal trust fund. She kicked an empty cardboard box out of her way and told him to pack his cheap clothes and get out of her sight. She spat on the floor near his shoes, turned her back on him, and stormed up the grand staircase to finish packing her diamond jewelry. The absolute coldness of her departure left Terrence gasping for air. The toxic alliance was completely dead. He was now entirely alone, surrounded by empty boxes and the shattered pieces of his fake elite life. Terrence was utterly paralyzed by a terror so deep it chilled his very bones. He was completely broke, facing a massive federal indictment for wire fraud, and now his wife was ruthlessly stealing his only child to save herself. The massive walls of the luxury mansion felt like they were rapidly closing in, ready to crush him. In a state of absolute blind panic, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped the device twice before he could unlock the screen. He scrolled through his contacts, ignoring his wealthy friends who had already blocked his number and his father-in-law, who was currently hiding from the authorities. There was only one person left in the entire world who possessed the massive financial resources to save him from total annihilation. He pressed the call button for his father. I was sitting quietly at my kitchen table reviewing the latest corporate acquisition reports when my phone began to buzz. I let it ring 4 times before I calmly answered. Terrence immediately burst into loud, desperate sobs the second the line connected. He cried harder than he did when he was a little boy. He frantically told me that Megan was divorcing him and trying to take Leo away forever. He begged me to help him stop her. He promised that if I just called off the corporate lawyers and unfroze his bank accounts, he would leave Megan completely and hand Leo over to me. He actually tried to use my innocent grandson as a bargaining chip to purchase his own freedom. He frantically swore that I could have full custody of the boy and that he would sign whatever legal papers I wanted. He pleaded with me to be a father to him, to show mercy to my own flesh and blood. He repeatedly chanted that we were family and that family was supposed to protect each other. The sheer hypocrisy of his words was absolutely astounding. He promised he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me if I just saved him from going to federal prison. He was completely pathetic, completely broken, and completely willing to sell his own child to escape the brutal consequences of his vicious crimes. I listened to his frantic crying without a single ounce of pity. He was only sorry because he got caught and lost absolutely everything. I spoke into the phone with a voice as hard and cold as solid steel. I told Terrence that the time for begging had officially expired the exact moment he forged my signature and tried to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. I told him he was no longer my son. He was simply a hostile liability that had been successfully neutralized. I calmly informed him that my legal team was already filing emergency custody papers for Leo based on the severe criminal indictments surrounding both him and Megan. I told him he had absolutely nothing left to offer me. Terrence gasped and tried to scream another pathetic apology, but I did not let him finish. I pressed the red button and permanently disconnected the call. I placed the phone face down on the wooden table and took a slow sip of my tea. The ultimate betrayal had zero negotiation value. The trap had completely snapped shut. He was now totally isolated, left to face the federal authorities entirely alone. My vengeance was clean, silent, and absolutely final. Richard Gallagher was a man who had spent his entire adult life successfully buying his way out of severe consequences. He firmly believed that the laws of the United States were only meant to punish the poor and the weak. By late Friday afternoon, the terrifying reality of his total financial annihilation had finally shattered his massive, unbreakable ego. He was trapped inside his lavish 12,000-square-foot mansion, pacing the expensive hardwood floors like a desperate hunted animal. The national news networks were running continuous live coverage of the massive fraud investigation surrounding his corporate real estate empire. His elite defense attorneys had completely stopped answering his frantic phone calls, leaving him entirely isolated. Richard knew the federal agents were actively hunting him, and he knew his soft body could never survive a single day inside a violent maximum security prison. He made a desperate and highly illegal decision to flee the country immediately. He ran heavily up the grand sweeping staircase into his master bedroom and pulled a heavy black leather duffel bag from the top shelf of his custom closet. He completely ignored his expensive tailored suits and his massive collection of diamond luxury watches. He aggressively shoved thick stacks of classified financial ledgers, hidden offshore account numbers, and encrypted computer hard drives deep into the dark bag. These specific documents were the ultimate keys to a secret $20 million slush fund he had buried in the Cayman Islands years ago. He zipped the heavy bag shut, his hands trembling violently with a chaotic mixture of pure fear and adrenaline. He ran down to the massive garage and bypassed his entire fleet of highly recognizable luxury sports cars. He grabbed the keys to a modest black security SUV. His highly paid private security team had already abandoned him hours ago, leaving the keys hanging on a simple metal hook. He desperately needed to remain completely invisible to the authorities. He drove out of his private gated community using the rear service exit, completely terrified that federal agents were already waiting at the front gate to ambush him. He was heading straight for a private executive airfield located on the dark, freezing outskirts of Chicago, where his chartered Gulfstream jet was fully fueled and waiting to fly him to the Caribbean. The private airfield was completely silent and heavily shrouded in the dark, freezing shadows of the brutal Chicago winter. Richard drove the black SUV directly onto the restricted tarmac, bypassing the main civilian terminal entirely. He saw the sleek white Gulfstream jet waiting patiently on the runway with its massive engines already whining loudly in preparation for immediate takeoff. A massive, overwhelming wave of pure relief washed over his panicked mind. He firmly believed he had successfully outsmarted the government and the invisible corporate monster that had suddenly destroyed his perfect life. He parked the heavy SUV near the metal boarding stairs, grabbed his thick leather duffel bag, and stepped out into the freezing wind. The brutal cold bit right through his expensive cashmere sweater, but he did not care. He did not even bother to close the heavy car door behind him. He practically sprinted toward the glowing warm lights of the aircraft cabin, completely desperate to escape American soil and disappear forever. He was less than 50 feet away from absolute freedom when the dark runway suddenly exploded with blinding white strobe lights. The deafening roar of heavy diesel engines violently shattered the quiet night. 3 massive armored tactical vehicles painted in matte black suddenly accelerated out of the deep shadows and violently skidded to a halt directly in front of the private jet. The armored trucks completely blocked the aircraft from moving forward on the runway. The bright, high-intensity spotlights mounted on the roofs of the heavy vehicles snapped on blinding Richard instantly. He dropped his heavy leather bag onto the freezing tarmac, raising his trembling arms to shield his eyes from the intense burning light. A dozen heavily armed federal agents poured out of the tactical vehicles wearing dark body armor with the large yellow letters printed boldly across their chests. They raised their heavy weapons and aggressively ordered Richard to get down on the freezing concrete immediately. The lead federal agent stepped forward, holding a heavy megaphone and a thick stack of official legal documents. His authoritative voice boomed across the icy runway, echoing sharply off the metal body of the private jet. He formally announced that Richard Gallagher was under immediate federal arrest for massive corporate wire fraud, severe tax evasion, and international money laundering. Richard stood completely frozen on the icy tarmac, his heart hammering violently against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was completely surrounded by the exact nightmare he was desperately trying to outrun. He frantically screamed at the armed federal agents, claiming they had absolutely no legal jurisdiction to hold him and aggressively demanding to speak with his private defense attorney. He foolishly tried to assert his wealthy elite privilege, completely refusing to accept that his absolute power was permanently gone. He yelled that he was a highly respected pillar of the Chicago business community and that they were making a catastrophic career-ending mistake. The lead federal agent completely ignored his pathetic, hysterical screaming. He walked directly up to Richard and forcefully kicked the heavy black duffel bag open with his heavy tactical boot. The encrypted hard drives and the secret offshore ledgers immediately spilled out onto the cold ground, completely exposing his criminal escape plan to the world. The federal agents did not randomly stumble upon this private executive airfield by accident. They were acting on a highly specific and incredibly detailed intelligence dossier. Exactly 2 weeks ago, while Richard was busy mocking my cheap jacket at his exclusive country club, my corporate intelligence team had successfully compiled a massive 300-page investigative report. The heavy file contained flawless digital evidence of every single illegal transaction, every fake corporate shell company, and every offshore tax haven Richard had ever utilized over the past decade. Bradley Foster had securely hand-delivered that massive dossier directly to the private desk of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Director in Washington. I had meticulously orchestrated this exact moment down to the very last detail. I knew Richard would immediately try to run the second his corporate bank accounts were frozen. I deliberately allowed him to believe he could actually escape just so the federal agents could catch him red-handed with the physical evidence of his secret offshore accounts. I wanted him to taste the sweet air of absolute freedom right before the heavy steel doors of justice slammed permanently shut in his arrogant face. The overwhelming volume of irrefutable evidence I provided guaranteed that Richard Gallagher would never see the outside of a federal prison cell ever again. 2 massive federal agents violently grabbed Richard's arms and forcefully twisted them hard behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs loudly clicked into place, tightly binding the wrists of the former billionaire. They aggressively pushed him forward and slammed his chest forcefully against the freezing metal hood of the black armored truck. Richard gasped for air, his face pressed hard against the icy steel, completely stripped of his fake dignity and his immense arrogance. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated his terrified, crying face as the lead agent loudly read him his federal Miranda rights. At that exact same moment, miles away in the chaotic mess of her luxurious mansion, Megan was sitting on the hardwood floor surrounded by half-packed cardboard boxes. She stared blankly at the bright screen of her expensive flat-screen television. The breaking news emergency alert flashed rapidly across the bottom of the screen, showing live aerial helicopter footage of the massive raid at the private executive airfield. The news anchor enthusiastically reported the humiliating capture and arrest of the corrupt real estate tycoon Richard Gallagher. Megan watched her powerful, untouchable father being violently shoved into the back of a dark federal transport van like a common, dangerous street criminal. She covered her mouth with her trembling, manicured hands and let out a long, agonizing scream of pure, absolute despair. The complete destruction of her elite, powerful family was officially complete. The giant empire of arrogance had been burned to ashes, and the cold winter wind was blowing it all away. December 24th arrived with a brutal snowstorm that completely buried the city of Chicago. The streets were quiet and empty as people gathered inside their warm homes to celebrate the holidays. I was sitting entirely alone inside my small, dark apartment. There was no Christmas tree standing in the corner. There were no brightly wrapped presents sitting on the floor. There was absolutely no holiday music playing in the background. The room was completely silent, except for the low howling of the freezing wind rattling my thin glass windows. I was wearing the exact same worn-out corduroy jacket I had worn to the Gallagher Thanksgiving dinner exactly 1 month ago. Megan had stood in her $1,000,000 dining room and aggressively demanded that I stay far away from their perfect Christmas. She had called me a pathetic social burden and told me to rot in isolation. I was a man of my word. I was giving her exactly what she asked for. I stayed far away from their celebrations, but their celebrations no longer existed. The massive Gallagher mansion was currently sitting completely empty and dark, entirely locked down by federal authorities. Megan was living in a cheap, rented motel room on the outskirts of the city, desperately trying to hide from the relentless paparazzi. Terrence was sitting inside a freezing county jail cell waiting for his massive federal fraud trial to begin. Richard Gallagher was wearing an orange jumpsuit in a maximum security holding facility completely stripped of his arrogant billionaire identity. The elite family that had mercilessly mocked my existence was currently experiencing the most miserable and terrifying Christmas of their entire lives. I sat in my wooden chair, completely unbothered by the cold, staring out the frosted window at the falling heavy snow. I picked up a simple ceramic cup from my cracked wooden table and took a slow sip of hot black tea. The bitter taste grounded me perfectly in the present moment. I did not feel any sadness or regret about spending the holiday completely alone. Solitude is only painful when you are waiting for someone to save you. I did not need to be saved. I was the architect of my own absolute peace. I thought about the sheer arrogance that had led my enemies to their own complete destruction. They had firmly believed that money and social status made them completely invincible. They thought they could step on anyone they considered beneath them without ever facing a single consequence. They looked at my black skin, my cheap shoes, and my humble apartment and automatically assumed I was a weak, helpless victim. Their massive prejudice was their ultimate fatal flaw. They were so incredibly busy judging my outer appearance that they completely failed to see the massive steel trap I was building right under their feet. If Terrence had simply acted like a decent son and defended me at that Thanksgiving dinner, he would currently be enjoying a life of absolute luxury backed by my massive hidden trust fund. If Megan had simply treated me with basic human respect, she would still be sleeping inside her giant mansion. If Richard had not been consumed by his own greedy ego, he would still be running his massive real estate empire. Every single terrible thing that happened to them was the direct mathematical result of their own vicious choices. I was simply the mirror that perfectly reflected their own absolute cruelty back onto them. I took another slow sip of my tea, feeling a deep, profound sense of calm settling into my bones. The dark storm outside was raging violently, but the storm inside my life was completely over. I had successfully amputated the toxic infection from my bloodline. The path was finally clear to bring my grandson Leo into a healthy and stable environment. The sudden bright glow of my computer monitor broke the dark shadows of my small living room. An encrypted email notification popped up silently on the screen. It was a highly secure message from my lead attorney, Bradley Foster. Even on Christmas Eve, my corporate legal team was working with absolute lethal efficiency. I set my teacup down and slowly walked over to the desk. I opened the encrypted file and began reading the thick legal text. It was the final master acquisition contract. Following the total collapse of Gallagher Commercial Properties and the massive federal arrests, the bankruptcy courts had quickly organized a massive emergency liquidation auction to pay off the defrauded banks. Horizon Group, my completely anonymous private investment firm, had officially stepped in as the absolute primary bidder. Because the market was completely panicked and the Gallagher reputation was incredibly toxic, no other major corporate developers dared to touch the highly radioactive assets. We had successfully purchased the absolute entirety of the Gallagher real estate portfolio for pennies on the dollar. The massive luxury skyscrapers, the sprawling commercial shopping centers, and the heavily disputed Pinnacle development project were all completely transferred into my direct legal control. I scrolled down the lengthy legal document, reading the vast list of extremely valuable properties that now belonged entirely to me. Richard Gallagher had spent 40 long years ruthlessly destroying other people to build his massive elite empire. In less than 30 days, I had completely and legally consumed his entire life work. The immense corporate power he had wielded like a weapon was now securely locked inside my personal private trust. He would spend the rest of his natural life rotting in a cold federal prison cell, while the old black man he had viciously mocked became the absolute undisputed king of Chicago real estate. The flawless execution of the hostile corporate takeover was completely finalized. I carefully reviewed the final signature page of the master acquisition contract. Everything was perfectly prepared and legally bulletproof. I reached out and pressed my finger against the digital biometric scanner attached to my computer keyboard. The screen flashed bright green, confirming my electronic signature. The contract was instantly finalized and permanently recorded in the state corporate registry. I closed the secure file and opened a specialized automated scheduling program. Bradley Foster had prepared a massive global press release officially announcing the total corporate buyout. The document fully exposed Horizon Group as the mysterious savior of the Gallagher collapse. But more importantly, the press release finally revealed the true identity of the sole chairman and majority shareholder. It boldly listed the name Calvin Brooks for the entire world to see. I set the digital timer for exactly 12 o'clock midnight. I wanted the absolute truth to strike the public exactly as Christmas Day officially began. I leaned back in my wooden chair and watched the digital clock slowly count down the final remaining minutes. The ultimate explosive payload was securely loaded and actively ticking. The world was about to wake up to a massive corporate shockwave. The digital clock on my kitchen counter silently flipped to 12:15 in the morning. It was officially Christmas Day. The dark apartment was entirely still except for the steady rhythm of the freezing snow tapping against the glass. I sat in my wooden chair, completely awake, waiting for the inevitable reaction. Exactly 1 minute later, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the hard surface of the table. The caller identification displayed a number coming from the county jail holding facility. I picked up the phone and pressed the green button. I did not say a single word. I just listened to the heavy, frantic breathing on the other end of the line. It was Terrence. He was using his one allotted phone call from the holding cell. His voice was completely unrecognizable. It was raw, hoarse, and filled with a level of absolute terror I had never heard from him before. He sounded like a man who had just watched the ground completely open up beneath his feet. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not beg for his freedom or ask for a lawyer. He was hyperventilating so hard he could barely form a coherent sentence. The arrogant confidence of the elite corporate vice president was completely gone. He was nothing but a terrified prisoner wearing an orange jumpsuit, shivering in a cold concrete cell. He finally managed to force the words out of his throat. He screamed my name in absolute horror. He yelled that he was watching the television mounted on the wall of the holding area. He demanded to know what was happening on the screen. Terrence shrieked into the heavy plastic receiver of the jailhouse phone. He aggressively ordered me to turn on my television right that very second. He was sobbing uncontrollably, telling me that he must be losing his mind or hallucinating from the stress of the arrest. He yelled that the midnight financial broadcast on the Fox News network was currently covering the total liquidation of the Gallagher real estate empire. He said the news anchors were breaking an emergency global story about the massive corporate buyout that had just been finalized minutes ago. He frantically described the scene playing out on the small television in his cell block. He said the reporters were talking about Horizon Group, the anonymous private investment firm that had legally purchased every single asset his father-in-law had ever owned. Terrence was completely hysterical. He told me the news network was finally unmasking the secret billionaire who owned Horizon Group. He said they were projecting a high-definition photograph of the mysterious corporate chairman right across the national broadcast. His voice cracked violently as he screamed that the photograph on the television screen was me. He was staring directly at a picture of his own father. He yelled that it had to be a massive mistake or a cruel joke played by the federal investigators to psychologically torture him. He begged me to tell him it was a lie. He pleaded with me to explain how a retired old man living in a cheap rented apartment in a bad neighborhood was suddenly being announced as the most powerful real estate tycoon in the entire state of Illinois. He told me the news anchor was explicitly stating my full name, Calvin Brooks, over and over again. He said the entire jail holding area was staring at the television in absolute silence while he fell to his knees in pure shock. He was experiencing a complete psychological collapse in real time. The ultimate reality of his horrific betrayal was finally crashing down onto his head with the heavy weight of a falling skyscraper. He realized the man he had violently cast aside to impress his rich wife was actually the ultimate master of their entire financial universe. I did not need to turn on my television. I already had the live news feed streaming directly onto my computer monitor. I watched the exact same broadcast Terrence was staring at from his cold concrete cell. The bright red breaking news ticker crawled rapidly across the bottom of the screen. The white letters spelled out the truth for the world to read. Mystery investor Calvin Brooks acquires entire Gallagher empire following massive fraud arrests. The news anchor was speaking with intense journalistic excitement, detailing the absolute brilliance of the hostile corporate takeover. Right next to the anchor was a massive high-definition photograph of me. It was not a picture of a poor old man in a worn corduroy jacket begging for scraps at a wealthy dinner table. It was a professional corporate portrait taken years ago for a private financial registry. I was wearing a bespoke, tailored black suit, and a silk tie staring directly into the camera with absolute cold authority. The image radiated immense power and supreme financial dominance. The anchor meticulously explained that I had secretly built a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm over 4 decades, completely hiding my massive wealth behind thick layers of secure private trusts. They detailed exactly how my company had flawlessly executed the purchase of the fraudulent $10 million loan and legally triggered the total collapse of Richard Gallagher's corrupt company overnight. They praised the swift and ruthless efficiency of the corporate acquisition, calling it the most brilliant and aggressive financial maneuver of the entire decade. They explicitly stated that I was now the sole legal owner of the luxury mansions, the commercial shopping centers, and the highly disputed Pinnacle development project. Every single asset Terrence and Megan had worshipped and committed federal crimes for now belonged entirely to me. I listened to the news anchor perfectly summarize the total destruction of my enemies. I looked at my own face projected across national television and felt absolutely nothing but the cold satisfaction of a perfectly executed strategy. The ghost had officially stepped out of the shadows and taken the throne. The entire city of Chicago was currently waking up to the massive realization that the old black man they had ignored was actually the undisputed king of the corporate board. I spoke directly into the phone with a voice as calm and heavy as a stone dropping into a deep black well. I told Terrence that the television was not lying. I told him I was Horizon Group. I told him I was the one who deliberately froze the bank account, seized the luxury mansion, and handed the forgery evidence directly to the federal agents. I told him I had secretly funded his pathetic, luxurious lifestyle for years, and he had repaid my silent generosity with absolute treachery. I reminded him of the exact moment he told me to rot in isolation. I told him he was the one who had chosen this exact path, and now he had to walk it all the way to the end. A sharp gasp echoed through the phone. Terrence finally understood the absolute magnitude of his catastrophic mistake. He realized the poor beggar he had brutally thrown out into the freezing snow was actually the supreme financial lord who held the absolute power of life and death over his entire existence. He realized he had willingly handed a loaded gun to the only man capable of completely destroying him. The line suddenly went completely dead. Terrence had dropped the heavy plastic receiver onto the cold concrete floor of the jail, completely paralyzed by the horrific truth. I ended the call and set my phone down on the wooden table. The massive shockwave had successfully hit its final target. The absolute truth had finally set me free and locked them away in their own personal hell forever. The freezing morning of December 27th brought a violent disruption to the quiet street outside my apartment building. I was standing by the window drinking my coffee when I heard the loud, aggressive screeching of rubber tires skidding against the icy asphalt. A cheap dented rental car violently hopped the curb and slammed into the frozen snowbank right in front of the main entrance. The doors flew open. Terrence and Megan practically fell out of the vehicle. Terrence had just been released from the county jail holding facility an hour earlier. Megan had completely drained the absolute last remaining pennies of her hidden emergency cash just to pay the massive bail bond to get him out. They were no longer the perfectly polished elite couple who had sneered at me during Thanksgiving. They looked like terrified refugees fleeing from a war zone. Megan's expensive blonde hair was a tangled, greasy mess hanging wildly around her pale face. She was wearing a mismatched sweatsuit and a thin jacket, completely inappropriate for the harsh Chicago winter. Terrence was still wearing the exact same clothes he had on when he was arrested. His shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His face was covered in dark, heavy stubble, and his eyes were wild with absolute panic. They had absolutely nowhere else to go. Their luxury mansion was locked down, their bank accounts were frozen, their wealthy friends had completely abandoned them. They had driven straight from the jail to my building in a desperate, chaotic state of mind. They were completely stripped of their massive egos and forced to face the harsh, brutal reality of the monster they had created. I watched them sprint toward the heavy glass doors of the lobby, slipping on the ice and frantically pushing each other. I turned away from the window and walked toward the front door of my apartment. I was no longer wearing the faded corduroy jacket or the cheap, scuffed shoes. I was wearing a bespoke midnight blue suit crafted from the finest Italian wool. My shoes were highly polished leather. I looked exactly like the multi-billion-dollar corporate titan the news networks had broadcasted to the entire world. I took the elevator down to the ground floor lobby. Through the glass elevator doors, I could see the chaotic scene unfolding below. Terrence and Megan were desperately trying to push their way past the main security desk, but this was no longer a simple residential building with a sleepy doorman. I had upgraded the security protocol the exact moment the corporate buyout was finalized. 3 massive private security contractors wearing dark tactical suits and carrying heavy weapons were completely blocking their path. The guards stood like an impenetrable brick wall, refusing to let them take a single step further into my domain. Megan was screaming hysterically, crying and pulling at the guards' dark uniforms. Terrence was shouting my name frantically, demanding to see his father. The heavy elevator doors slid open with a soft mechanical chime. The loud, chaotic screaming in the lobby instantly stopped. Terrence and Megan froze completely still. They stared at me in absolute shock. They had seen the photograph on the television, but seeing the physical transformation in person completely shattered their minds. I walked slowly across the polished marble floor. My footsteps echoed loudly in the sudden dead silence. I radiated absolute power and total control. I did not look like the poor old man they had thrown away. I looked like their ultimate judge and executioner. The security guards immediately stepped aside, parting like the Red Sea to let me pass. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from my son and his wife, looking down at them with cold, dead eyes. Megan immediately dropped to her knees right there on the cold, hard marble floor. All of her supreme upper-class arrogance was completely gone. The woman who had proudly hasted my homemade pie into the trash and told me I smelled like a cheap nursing home was now groveling at my expensive leather shoes. She sobbed loudly, her tears leaving dark streaks of ruined makeup down her pale cheeks. She violently grabbed the fabric of my trousers, begging me to forgive her. She frantically apologized for every single cruel word she had ever spoken to me. She swore she was a changed woman and that she finally understood the true meaning of family respect. She begged me to call off the federal investigators and return her father's real estate company. She pleaded for her luxury mansion and her elite lifestyle, promising she would be the best daughter-in-law in the entire world. I stood perfectly still and let her cry. I did not feel a single drop of pity. Her tears were entirely fake, born from absolute terror rather than genuine remorse. She was only sorry because she had lost her money. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick white envelope. I dropped it directly onto her trembling hands. The heavy paper hit her palms with a sharp slap. I told her in a low mechanical voice that the envelope contained her official eviction notice. I explained that the cheap motel she was currently hiding in was actually owned by a subsidiary of Horizon Group. I told her I was legally terminating her temporary lease effective immediately. I also told her the envelope contained the finalized foreclosure documents for her private luxury mansion. I reminded her of the exact moment she told me to rot in isolation and proudly declared that she was a burden to society. I told her she was now the absolute lowest burden on the corporate food chain. I told her she had absolutely nothing left to her name and that she would spend the rest of her miserable life working for minimum wage just to survive. The brutal, absolute finality of my words completely broke Terrence. He watched his wife sobbing hysterically on the floor, holding the legal documents that sealed their total destruction. The intense psychological pressure of the federal indictment, the humiliating arrest, and the total loss of his stolen empire violently boiled over into pure animalistic rage. He let out a loud guttural scream and violently lunged directly at me. He raised his fists, aiming straight for my face, completely blinded by his massive, uncontrolled anger. He wanted to physically destroy the man who had outsmarted him, but he never even got close. My private security guards moved with terrifying lightning speed. Before Terrence could even take a second step, a massive guard grabbed him by the back of his dirty shirt and violently slammed him face first into the hard marble floor. Another guard immediately dropped a heavy knee directly onto his spine, pinning him completely flat against the cold stone. Terrence gasped for air, his face painfully smashed against the ground. His arms were forcefully twisted behind his back in a brutal submission hold. He struggled helplessly like a pathetic crushed insect. I looked down at his defeated body, completely untouched by his violent outburst. The pathetic physical attack was his absolute final desperate move, and it had failed miserably. He was entirely broken, completely humiliated, and totally at my absolute mercy. Megan saw her husband violently pinned to the marble floor, and her raw survival instincts immediately kicked into high gear. She did not try to help Terrence. She abandoned him completely and threw herself forward, sliding across the highly polished stone until she was directly at my feet. She wrapped her thin, shaking arms tightly around my legs, burying her tear-stained face against the expensive, tailored fabric of my trousers. She sobbed with a frantic, desperate energy, begging me to show her mercy. She cried out that she was just a foolish young girl who made terrible mistakes under the heavy pressure of her wealthy father's extreme expectations. When those pathetic lies completely failed to move me, she immediately tried to use the ultimate weapon of emotional manipulation. She brought up my grandson, Leo. She swore that if I kicked her out onto the freezing street, the little boy would suffer immensely. She claimed the innocent child desperately needed his mother, and that I would be destroying a young boy's life if I did not give her back the luxury mansion and the frozen bank accounts. She promised I could see Leo every single day, and that we could all be one big happy family living together in absolute peace. She was shamelessly using her own flesh and blood as a human shield to protect herself from the brutal consequences of her own horrific greed. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, desperately hoping to find a single drop of grandfatherly warmth or weakness. She firmly thought the mere mention of the innocent boy would instantly melt my heart and make me surrender my absolute power. She was completely and entirely wrong. I looked down at her miserable, crying face. I did not step back or try to pull my legs away from her desperate grip. I simply stood there like a massive, immovable stone statue. I slowly bent down until my face was only inches away from hers. My voice was incredibly low and sharp, like a piece of jagged broken glass cutting effortlessly through the silent lobby. I did not yell because true power never needs to raise its voice. I spoke with absolute, terrifying clarity. I reminded her of the exact events that took place on Thanksgiving night. I recited her own vicious words back to her with perfect photographic memory. I told her I vividly remembered the loud crash of my homemade sweet potato pie hitting the bottom of her stainless steel trash can. I reminded her how she proudly announced in front of 20 wealthy elite guests that I smelled like a cheap nursing home, and that my very existence was a dark stain on her pristine family reputation. I repeated her exact demand that I stay far away from her perfect Christmas, because I was nothing but a pathetic social burden. I asked her why a supreme elite socialite like herself would ever want to live inside a building owned by a worthless old black man. Megan gasped heavily and covered her mouth, shaking her head frantically from side to side. She tried to stammer out an excuse, saying she did not mean those horrible things, but I completely ignored her pathetic lies. I told her she meant every single syllable she spoke that night. I explained that true character is always revealed when people firmly believe they hold absolute power over someone they consider weak and defenseless. She had shown me her true dark soul that night, and it was completely rotten to the core. I told her I was simply granting her ultimate wish. She wanted me completely removed from her luxurious elite world, so I legally purchased her entire world and violently removed her from it instead. The absolute poetic justice of the situation was entirely lost on her greedy, panicked mind. Megan continued to sob loudly and violently, clutching my legs as if I were the absolute last life raft on a rapidly sinking ship. She frantically offered to work for me, to be my personal servant, to do absolutely anything I commanded if I just returned her stolen wealth and her elite social status. I straightened my posture and looked down at her with total, absolute disgust. I told her that a fake apology born entirely from a frozen bank account was completely worthless to me. I explained that true evil cannot simply be forgiven with a few cheap tears and empty, desperate promises. It must be brutally eradicated so it can never harm another innocent person ever again. I told her that regarding my grandson Leo, she no longer had any say in his future. I calmly informed her that my elite legal team had already filed an emergency petition for full, permanent custody of the child. I assured her that the family court judge would easily grant my request the second they reviewed the massive federal fraud indictments currently hanging over both her and Terrence. I promised her that Leo would be raised with genuine love, strict discipline, and true respect, far away from her highly toxic and poisonous influence. Megan's eyes widened in pure, absolute horror. Her ultimate bargaining chip was completely neutralized. She finally realized she had absolutely nothing left to offer and absolutely nothing left to threaten me with. her entire reality completely shattered. At that exact moment, the heavy glass doors of the lobby slid open with a soft mechanical hum. 4 uniformed Chicago police officers walked purposefully into the building. My private security team had called them the exact second Terrence and Megan violently crashed their rental car into the snowbank outside. The officers immediately saw Terrence pinned aggressively to the floor and Megan hysterically grabbing my legs. They stepped forward rapidly to take absolute control of the chaotic situation. They grabbed Megan's arms and forcefully pulled her off of my legs, dragging her to her feet while she kicked and screamed like a wild feral animal. The police officers grabbed Terrence from the private security guards and forcefully pulled his arms tightly behind his back. They slapped heavy cold steel handcuffs on his wrists for the second time in 24 hours. Terrence did not try to fight them. He hung his head completely defeated, his arrogant spirit utterly broken into a million tiny pieces. Megan continued to violently thrash and scream loudly, cursing my name to the high heavens as 2 officers physically carried her toward the exit. I stood firmly in the absolute center of the pristine marble lobby and watched them being dragged away. I did not blink. I did not feel a single ounce of remorse or guilt. The heavy glass doors slid open, letting in a sudden, harsh blast of freezing winter wind. The officers pushed the ruined elite couple out into the brutal, unforgiving cold snow. The glass doors automatically slid shut, locking automatically with a solid, heavy click. Their frantic screaming was instantly cut off, completely silencing their toxic presence forever. I turned around and walked calmly toward my private elevator. The lobby was perfectly clean and completely quiet once again. The trash had been entirely taken out. Time moves forward relentlessly, and the federal justice system did not show a single ounce of mercy to Richard Gallagher. The highly publicized criminal trial lasted only 3 weeks before the jury returned a guilty verdict on all 47 counts of federal wire fraud and international money laundering. The federal judge sentenced Richard to 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The former billionaire who once dined on expensive steaks and mocked the poor was now eating terrible bland food off a metal tray surrounded by violent, dangerous criminals. His massive, fragile ego was permanently buried behind thick concrete walls and heavy iron bars. Megan experienced a completely different kind of prison. The family court judge stripped her of all her hidden assets and personal trust funds to pay off the massive restitution fines owed to the defrauded banks. She was forced to move into a tiny rundown studio apartment in a highly dangerous neighborhood. The elite socialite who used to wear custom silk dresses and attend million-dollar galas was now wearing a cheap, stiff polyester uniform. She found a minimum wage job working as a cashier at a local discount supermarket. Every single day, she had to stand on her aching feet for 10 long hours scanning cheap groceries for the exact same working-class people she used to treat like absolute garbage. Her former wealthy friends frequently shopped at that exact supermarket, and they always made sure to walk directly through her checkout lane just to stare at her humiliating downfall with cruel, mocking smiles. Terrence faced a similar miserable fate. He avoided federal prison by pleading guilty and fully cooperating as a star witness against his father-in-law, but the massive financial penalties completely ruined his life. He was drowning in millions of dollars of insurmountable legal debt. The man who used to drive a brand new luxury Porsche was now driving a beaten-up delivery box truck. He spent 14 hours a day delivering heavy packages in the freezing rain and the brutal summer heat just to survive. He frequently had to deliver boxes to the very same exclusive gated communities where he used to attend lavish cocktail parties, forced to look away in deep shame whenever a former friend opened the door. The most important victory of the entire war did not happen in the corporate boardroom or the criminal courts. The true ultimate victory took place inside the quiet, serious halls of the family courthouse. The intense legal battle for my grandson Leo was swift and completely decisive. My elite legal team presented the judge with a massive mountain of irrefutable evidence detailing the severe criminal convictions, the massive financial fraud, and the highly unstable living conditions of both Terrence and Megan. The judge took one look at the high-definition video of Terrence screaming like a lunatic and attempting to bribe a hostile witness. She then reviewed the federal indictments proving Megan had actively participated in hiding stolen corporate assets. The judge immediately ruled that both parents were completely unfit to raise a child. She signed the final official decree granting me full permanent legal and physical custody of my grandson. When the state social worker brought Leo to my apartment, he was scared and highly confused. He had endured months of chaotic screaming matches between his parents and the terrifying trauma of police raids. I knelt down on the hard floor and pulled him into a warm, safe embrace. I promised him that he would never have to hear another loud argument or see another police officer kicking down his front door ever again. I immediately enrolled him in a prestigious private school completely paid for by my massive corporate trust. I hired the best child psychologists in the city to help him process the trauma his parents had inflicted on his young, fragile mind. I systematically removed every single trace of the toxic Gallagher entitlement from his daily life. I taught him how to read books about history and science. I taught him the true value of honest hard work and the absolute importance of treating every single human being with dignity and respect regardless of how much money they had in their bank account. I watched the deep fear slowly melt away from his bright eyes, replaced by a genuine happy innocence. I had successfully severed the infected branches of the family tree and saved the youngest leaf from rotting. The morning of New Year Day arrived with a bright, clear blue sky. The brutal winter storms had finally passed, leaving the entire city covered in a peaceful blanket of pure white snow. I was no longer living in the cheap, cramped apartment with the broken wooden door. I was sitting inside the massive grand living room of the exact same 12,000 square foot luxury mansion that used to belong to Richard Gallagher. I had legally evicted my enemies and claimed the physical castle as my own personal fortress. The massive house no longer felt cold or filled with arrogant greed. It felt warm and completely alive. The towering floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the frozen lake outside. A massive wood fire crackled brightly inside the heavy stone fireplace, casting a warm golden light across the expensive polished hardwood floors. I sat comfortably in a large leather armchair wearing a soft cashmere sweater and perfectly tailored trousers. Across the large room, little Leo was sitting on a thick woven rug, completely absorbed in his own magical world. He was happily building a massive, intricate train track using the wooden toy sets I had bought him for Christmas. He laughed brightly as the small wooden train cars successfully crossed a wooden bridge he had just constructed. The sound of his genuine, joyful laughter was the absolute greatest return on investment I had ever achieved in my entire life. He was completely safe. He was entirely loved. He was growing up in an environment of absolute stability and supreme peace. I watched him carefully connect the wooden tracks, realizing that I was not just building a financial empire anymore. I was building a true, lasting legacy. I had successfully transformed a massive corporate war into a secure sanctuary for my family. The massive wealth I had accumulated over 4 decades finally had a true, meaningful purpose. It was an unbreakable shield to protect the innocent and a heavy sword to destroy the wicked. I reached out and picked up my favorite ceramic cup from the polished mahogany side table. I took a slow, deep sip of hot black tea. The rich flavor settled perfectly on my tongue. The absolute silence of the massive house was incredibly beautiful. There were no more frantic phone calls from greedy children demanding more money. There were no more arrogant billionaires threatening to destroy my life. The massive game of corporate chess was officially over, and the board was completely cleared of all enemies. The brutal lesson of cause and effect had been permanently carved into the very foundation of the city. Arrogance and greed will always eventually blind you to the quiet, invisible threats building right beneath your feet. True power never needs to scream for attention. True power sits in absolute silence, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. I am Calvin Brooks. I survived their extreme cruelty. I flawlessly dismantled their empire. I completely reclaimed my family. The silent correction is officially complete. If you enjoyed hearing my story, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that true justice always finds a way to balance the scales. I will see you all in the next video. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true family is never defined by a shared bloodline. It is defined by mutual respect and unbreakable loyalty. Arrogance and greed are always incredibly loud, but they are ultimately very fragile. When you allow your massive ego to completely blind you to the quiet strength of others, you are simply digging your own grave. True power does not need to scream or boast. It observes, it calculates, and it strikes with absolute precision. You must never let anyone mistake your silent humility for weakness. Sometimes you must completely burn a rotten bridge to build a safe fortress. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more life lessons about survival and absolute justice. Tell me in the comments below exactly how you would have handled a massive betrayal from your own flesh and blood.